Hey you? Yeah, welcome back. Come in, get comfortable. Grab your blanket, adjust that pillow just right. Because tonight we're going somewhere most history books never bother to take you. Picture this. It is the year 1191. Somewhere in the English countryside a man is strapping on his armour. His horse is waiting. His men are lined up outside the gate, breath steaming in the cold morning air. And standing in the doorway of the stone castle, not crying, not trembling, is his wife. He reaches into his belt. He pulls out a ring of heavy iron keys, and without a single word he places them in her hands. That is it. That's the whole ceremony. No speech, no contract, no official title. Just keys, and everything those keys unlocked. Because here is the thing that will keep you awake for just a few more minutes and then send you into the deepest, most satisfied sleep. Those keys were not just for doors and storage rooms. Those keys were the keys to an entire world. A world that ran on her judgment, her decisions, her voice. A world that without her would simply fall apart. And yet, and this is the part that gets me every single time, history almost never wrote her name down. Before we go any further into this story, if you find yourself settling in and feeling that this is exactly the kind of thing you needed tonight, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, if you have not already. And if you feel moved to leave a comment, I would genuinely love to know, where are you right now, and what time is it where you are? Drop it below. I read every single one. Now, dim the lights just a little more, let that fan hum softly in the background, and let tonight's story begin. We have a habit, all of us, of imagining the Middle Ages in a very particular way. Kings on thrones, knights on horseback, battles, sieges, crusades, men doing enormous, dramatic, loud things. And off in the corner of the painting, usually half in shadow, stands a woman, embroidering something, waiting. History handed us that image for centuries, and we believed it. Why would we not? Most of the chronicles from the medieval period were written by monks and clergymen, men who spent their days in monasteries, who almost never interacted with noblewomen, and who, when they did write about women, were far more interested in whether those women were virtuous or sinful than in whether they were competent. Which means an enormous amount of what actually happened, the real daily machinery of medieval life, was simply never recorded. Not because it was unimportant, because the people who were doing it were not considered worth writing about. Tonight we are going to correct that, and we're going to start at the very beginning with the single most important moment in a noblewoman's life in medieval Europe. Not her wedding day as you might expect, not the birth of her first child, but the morning her husband left for war, because that is the morning everything changed. Let us talk about those keys. The ring of keys that a noblewoman carried was not decorative. I want to be very clear about that. In paintings and illuminated manuscripts from the 12th and 13th centuries, you can often spot noblewomen with a heavy ring of iron keys hanging from their belt, and modern eyes tend to skim right past it. Oh, she has keys. How quaint. But medievalists will tell you that the key ring was one of the most loaded symbols in all of the Middle Ages. Each key opened something specific. The granary, the wine cellar, the armoury, the treasury, the apothecary chest where the medicines and poisons were kept. The room where the most valuable textiles were stored, cloth of gold, imported silks, wool so fine it could be traded for land. Access to those keys meant access to everything that kept the castle and its surrounding estates alive. And when a lord rode off to war, which in medieval Europe could mean anywhere from a few weeks to several years, depending on whether the campaign went well, whether he was captured, or whether he happened to die somewhere on a muddy field in France, those keys went to his wife, not to a male steward, not to his oldest son who was probably also at war, to her. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary, because at the exact same moment those keys were placed in her hands, something else was also true. Under medieval English law, Under a doctrine called coverture, that woman had virtually no legal existence of her own. Coverture. Let that word sit for a moment. It comes from the old French for covered, as in a married woman was legally covered by her husband's identity. She was not a separate person in the eyes of the law. She could not sign a contract in her own name. She could not own land. She could not appear in court without her husband's permission. She could not even write a will without his consent. She was legally a shadow, and yet she was now responsible for feeding, managing, defending, and financially sustaining a household of anywhere from 50 to several hundred people. She was responsible for the crops in the fields, the rents from the tenant farmers, the discipline of the knights who remained behind the medical care of the sick, the legal disputes that arose on the estate, the negotiations with merchants, the correspondence with her husband on campaign, and if things went truly badly, the military defence of the castle itself, a shadow with an impossible amount of work to do, and most of them did it quietly, competently, without complaint, or at least without complaint that was ever written down. The contradiction at the heart of this story is the thing I find most haunting. These women were trained from childhood to be capable of running everything, and simultaneously the entire legal and social structure around them insisted that they were capable of running nothing. Let me give you a sense of the scale of what we are talking about. When the Countess of Leicester, Eleanor de Montfort, decided in 1265 to move her household to Dover Castle, the baggage train required to transport her possessions and the supplies needed to run her establishment required more than 140 horses. 140 horses just to move her stuff, and that was not even considered unusual for a great lady of her rank. A castle in the high Middle Ages was not a home in any sense that we would recognize today. It was closer to a small town, or if you want a more modern comparison, a corporation. A very complicated, very fragile corporation, where the product was survival, and where failure meant hunger, disease, or enemy occupation. The staff alone was staggering. A well-run castle of middling size in 13th century England might employ a household steward, a marshal, a chamberlain, a constable, a treasurer, multiple chaplains, ladies-in-waiting, ladies' maids, a master of the wardrobe, a master of the kitchens, undercooks, bakers, brewers, falconers, huntsmen, grooms, stable boys, laundresses, seamstresses, gardeners, and a shifting population of men-at-arms, pages and squires, most of whom in wartime were gone, which meant the noblewoman was not just managing the people who remained. She was also managing the gaping holes left by the people who had left. She was doing 2 jobs, sometimes 3. So what did her day actually look like? It began before dawn. Historical accounts of castle life in the 13th and 14th centuries describe the lady of the house rising at first light or sometimes earlier. Her first act was prayer, either privately in her solar, the private chamber where she slept and worked, or in the castle chapel. This was not merely pious routine. For a noblewoman in wartime, prayer was also strategy. The church was the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. Keeping the castle clergy fed, respected, and on her side was politically important. Priests talked. Bishops had influence. A well-managed relationship with the local church could mean the difference between having legal support and being isolated. After Mass, she ate usually something small bread and perhaps a little cold meat or cheese because the next several hours would not permit much sitting down. Then she went to the Great Hall. The Great Hall of a medieval castle was not just where people ate. It was where the world came to her. Every morning, in the absence of her lord, she held what was effectively a small court. Messengers arrived with news from the wider world, from her husband's campaign, if she was lucky from neighbouring estates from the royal court. Tenants arrived with complaints, a boundary dispute with the next farm over a question about taxes owed, at the next quarter day a request to be released from an obligation they could no longer meet. Merchants arrived to negotiate contracts for grain wool leather candles, and she had to handle all of it, right there in front of everyone with authority and clarity, and crucially without appearing to step beyond what was considered appropriate for a woman. That last part, by the way, was its own extraordinary skill, maintaining authority while technically having none, giving orders while appearing to relay her husband's wishes, being firm while being perceived as gentle. It was a performance as demanding as any statecraft, and she had to deliver it every single morning. One chronicle from the period describes a noblewoman who dealt with a dispute between two tenants, reviewed 3 separate sets of estate accounts, instructed her steward on the delivery schedule for a grain shipment, dismissed a dishonest merchant and sent 3 separate letters, one to her husband, one to a neighbouring lord, and one to a bishop, all before the late morning meal. And then after all of that she went to inspect the kitchens, because someone had to. The food management alone deserves its own chapter, and we'll come back to that in a later part of our story. But for now, let me just give you one number that I think captures the sheer complexity of what these women were managing. A great castle in 13th century England might go through between 300 and 500 pounds of bread every single day, not per week, per day, plus ale because the water was often unsafe, plus meat, preserved fish, cheese, eggs, and seasonal vegetables. Everything had to be stored, rationed, tracked, and dispensed in the right quantities to the right people in the right order, because in a social hierarchy as rigid as medieval Europe, even the question of who ate what kind of bread was a matter of rank and protocol. White bread for the lord and lady and their honoured guests, brown bread for the upper servants, dark bread for everyone else. And the woman who managed all of this had to know at any given moment exactly how much of everything was in storage, how long it would last, and what she needed to acquire before the next market day. This is not housekeeping, this is logistics. Military-grade logistics, in fact. The same kind of supply chain management that determined whether armies won or lost battles. She just happened to be doing it without an army, and without a title that anyone bothered to record. Now I want to tell you about a woman named Nicola de la Haye. Nicola was born around 1150 in Lincolnshire, England. She was the daughter of a man named Richard de la Haye, who held the office of castellan, essentially the keeper of Lincoln Castle. When Richard died with no male heirs in 1169, that office passed to his daughter. Nicola was not a queen. She was not particularly famous. She was by the standards of her time a fairly ordinary noblewoman of a middling rank except for one thing. She held Lincoln Castle, and Lincoln Castle was one of the most strategically important fortresses in England. Over the course of her long life, she lived to approximately 80 years old, which was remarkable for the 12th and 13th centuries. Nicola navigated some of the most turbulent political crises in English history. She lived through the conflicts between King Richard the Lion-Hearted and his brother John. She lived through the Magna Carta. She lived through the First Barons' War, and through all of it she held her castle. In 1191, while her husband Gerard de Camville was away, embroiled in political trouble with the crown, Nicola defended Lincoln Castle against a siege by supporters of Prince John. She held it. Then, in 1216, when she was somewhere in her mid-60s, which was elderly by any medieval standard, Lincoln Castle was besieged again, this time by French forces supporting the rebel barons, who were trying to replace King John with Prince Louis of France. Her husband was long dead by then. There was no one else. Nicola de la Haye organised the defence herself. She commanded the garrison. She directed the provisioning. She held the walls. And when the English forces finally arrived to relieve the siege led by the great knight William Marshal, who was himself in his 70s and widely considered the greatest knight who ever lived, Nicola famously came down from the castle to meet him. She reportedly told him she was old and tired and would like to resign the keepership of the castle. He refused to accept her resignation, and she went back up to hold the walls. Her enemies in their chronicles described her as a most ingenious and evil-intentioned and vigorous old woman. Ingenious, evil-intentioned, vigorous. I think she probably considered all three of those a compliment. Nicola's story is remarkable precisely because it was written down. Most were not. For every Nicola de la Haye whose name survived because she was extraordinary enough or threatening enough to appear in enemy chronicles, there were hundreds of women who did equally impressive things in complete silence. Women who ran estates for years while their husbands were on crusade. Women who paid ransoms out of carefully hoarded household funds. Women who negotiated with hostile neighbours through letters carried by anonymous messengers. Women who held things together through plague, famine, crop failure and political upheaval, and who, when their husbands finally came home, handed the keys back and stepped back into the shadows, as if nothing had happened. There is something in that image that I find both heartbreaking and quietly astonishing. The act of handing those keys back, of choosing or being required to return to invisibility after years of being the person that everything depended on. It tells us something about what these women understood about power. They knew that their authority was borrowed. They knew it was temporary. They knew that the moment their husbands returned, or the moment the new male heir came of age, their role would contract back to its legal limits. And knowing all of that, they did the work anyway, every single day. Before dawn, in the great hall, in the kitchens, in the accounts room, on the walls, they did the work. Now you might be wondering, how did they know how? How did a young woman of 18 or 20 suddenly find herself capable of running a castle, managing accounts in multiple currencies, supervising armed men, and writing diplomatic letters to neighbouring lords? The answer is one we will spend a long time with in the next part of our story. Because the truth is, she was not improvising, not even close. She had been preparing for this exact moment since she was a child. And the education she received, the real education, not the polite fiction of needlework and prayer, was far more rigorous, far more practical, and far more fascinating than almost anything you have ever been taught about women in the Middle Ages. So settle in a little deeper, let the story carry you, because in a few moments we're going back even further to the schoolroom, the training ground, the very beginning of what it meant to be raised as a noblewoman in medieval Europe. And I promise you what she was taught will surprise you. You know, there is something I keep coming back to every time I think about these women. Not the sieges, not the dramatic moments with keys and castles, something quieter than that. It is this somewhere in England or France or the Holy Roman Empire in the year 1100 and something. There was a little girl, probably around 5 or 6 years old, sitting in a draughty stone room with a wax tablet on her lap, learning how to count in 2 different currencies, and nobody thought that was remarkable. That was just Tuesday. We spent the first part of our story standing at the moment the keys were handed over that charged silent morning, when a noblewoman became responsible for everything. But the reason she could handle it, the reason she did not simply collapse under the weight of it, is a story that began years, sometimes decades before that morning. It began in the schoolroom, or rather in the places that served as schoolrooms, because noblewomen in medieval Europe did not go to school in any sense we would recognize. What they had instead was something more intimate, more deliberately practical, and in many ways more demanding than any formal curriculum. They had a system of training so thorough, so comprehensive, that it prepared them for a role the world officially insisted they would never need to fill. That is the quiet irony sitting at the centre of this whole story, and I want you to hold on to it. Let me take you back to the very beginning. A girl born into the nobility in the 12th or 13th century entered a world that had already decided almost everything about her future before she drew her first breath. Her father's lands, his alliances, his debts, and his ambitions, all of these would shape who she married and therefore who she became. Marriage was not a romantic prospect. It was a political instrument, a business transaction sometimes arranged before the girl could walk, girls of the higher nobility could be formally betrothed as young as 3 or 4 years old. Most were actually married in the legal sense, the binding sense, by the time they were 12 or 13. Their husbands were usually considerably older. A man of the knightly class rarely married before his mid-20s because he needed to have acquired land first, and land took time, which meant that from the very beginning the mathematics of medieval marriage were stacked in a particular direction. The husband was older. The husband would almost certainly die first, and the wife, young and likely to outlive him by decades, would at some point find herself alone. The people who designed the medieval educational system for noblewomen, and I use that term loosely because it was not a formal institution, it was a set of deeply embedded cultural expectations, understood this completely. They were not naive about it. The training they gave girls was at its core training for survival in a world where men kept disappearing. So what did that training actually look like? The first thing that surprises most people is the language instruction. A noblewoman in 12th and 13th century England was expected to be fluent in at least 2 languages and functional in a third. Norman French was the language of the court, the aristocracy, and most formal social interaction. It was the language you used when you wanted to signal that you were educated and well-born. Latin was the language of the church, of legal documents, of medicine, of scholarship, and while noblewomen were not expected to compose Latin treatises, they needed enough of it to follow the mass intelligently, to understand the documents their clerks read to them, and to correspond with church officials. And then there was English, the vernacular, the language of the servants, and the farmers, and the market traders, which a well-run estate manager simply had to speak. 3 languages, by the time most of these girls were 10. Does that feel like the profile of someone who just sat quietly embroidering? I did not think so. Beyond languages, the practical curriculum was remarkable in its breadth. Household accounting was considered essential, and I want to be specific here because this was not simple addition. Medieval estate accounting involved tracking income and expenditure in multiple currencies simultaneously, since different obligations and transactions used different monetary systems. Silver pennies for local trade, gold coins for international transactions, goods calculated in units that varied by region. A noblewoman managing even a moderately sized estate needed the mathematical literacy to reconcile these systems and identify quickly and accurately whether her steward was cheating her. And stewards cheated when they thought they could get away with it. Constantly. The historical record is full of accounts of household stewards who skimmed from grain deliveries, falsified rent records, and manipulated accounts in the gaps left by absent lords. A noblewoman who did not understand the numbers was a noblewoman who would be robbed, so the numbers were taught rigorously. Then there was herbal medicine, and this one I want to spend a little time on because it is one of the most underappreciated aspects of what these women did. In an era before trained physicians were remotely accessible to most people, the lady of a castle was the primary healthcare provider for everyone on the estate. Not occasionally, routinely, every day. The servants who got injured in the kitchens, the farm labourers who came in with infected wounds from the fields, the children in the village with fever, the knights who came back from training exercises with broken bones and bruised muscles, they all came to her. Herbal medicine in the Middle Ages was not superstition dressed up as science, as it is sometimes portrayed. It was an accumulated body of practical knowledge that had been refined over centuries passed down through manuscripts, monastic texts, and the direct teaching of older women to younger ones. Plants like comfrey were used for broken bones and bruising, and modern research has confirmed that comfrey contains compounds called allantoin that genuinely promote cell growth and healing. Lavender was used as an antiseptic and a sedative correctly as it happens. Willow bark, which contains salicin, was used for pain and fever, and salicin is the compound from which aspirin was later synthesized in the 19th century. These women were not guessing. They were working from a practical pharmacopoeia that in many cases was more effective than the academic medicine being practiced in universities at the same time. A noblewoman's medical chest, the locked apothecary cabinet that was one of the items on that iron ring of keys, might contain dozens of prepared herbs dried and stored in specific conditions, along with instructions for preparation that had been copied and annotated by her mother and her grandmother before her. Medical knowledge, in other words, passed mother to daughter, generation to generation in the same quiet way that a recipe passes through a family. Except what was being passed was not a recipe for bread. It was a recipe for keeping people alive. Here is a detail that I think about sometimes. Christine de Pizan, the remarkable writer and intellectual who lived from 1364 to approximately 1430, and who was one of the first women in European history to earn a living as a professional author, wrote a book called The Treasure of the City of Ladies in 1405. It was essentially a conduct manual for noblewomen of different ranks, and it is one of the most valuable documents we have for understanding what medieval European society actually expected of women in practice, as opposed to what it claimed in theory. In that book, Christine wrote something that I find extraordinary. She instructed noblewomen to learn the military skills they needed to defend their property. She wrote, and I will give you the sense of it without reproducing her exact words, because the beauty of it really deserves to be heard in context, that a wise noblewoman should know how weapons work, should understand how to organize a defense, should be prepared to command her men if the need arose. She should have the heart of a man, Christine wrote, but the wisdom to know when not to use it. Now pause on that for a moment. Christine de Pizan was writing in 1405, 5.5 centuries ago, a practical guide instructing aristocratic women to know how to defend a castle under siege, not as an exceptional emergency measure, as a normal competency, something you learned the way you learn to manage the granary accounts or prepare a poultice for a wound. The fact that we're surprised by this today says something about how thoroughly the image of the passive medieval woman has been embedded in our collective imagination. And it says something too about who got to write history. Let me tell you about another dimension of this education that tends to get almost no attention, the training in what we would now call emotional intelligence and political management. A noblewoman was expected to be the social and diplomatic centre of her household. This was not soft work. It was strategic work of the highest order. She managed the social hierarchy of the castle, and that hierarchy was complex, fragile, and politically loaded. Ladies in waiting came from noble families. Their families had alliances and rivalries with each other, and with her husband's family. How she treated them, who she favoured, who she elevated, who she was seen to neglect, sent messages that rippled out far beyond the castle walls. A slight to a lady in waiting was a slight to her family. A family that felt slighted might become an enemy. An enemy might make life very difficult for your husband's military campaigns. Everything was connected. Nothing was purely personal. And navigating all of it required a kind of social intelligence that was in its own way as complex as any battlefield strategy. There is a concept in medieval studies that I find genuinely useful here, the idea of the noblewoman as a peace weaver. The term comes from Old English frithwith, and it originally referred to the practice of sealing alliances between families or kingdoms through strategic marriages. The woman was the living symbol of the peace between two groups, but the job did not end at the wedding. A peace weaver spent her entire married life actively maintaining that peace, smoothing tensions between her husband's family and her own, hosting the necessary feasts and gatherings where relationships were built and maintained, interceding when conflicts threatened to destabilize the alliance, being in practical terms a full-time diplomat who also happened to run a castle. The Countess Ida of Boulogne, mother of the crusader Godfrey of Bouillon, was described in contemporary chronicles precisely in these terms as a woman who maintained the peace between competing noble factions through a combination of generosity ceremony and what we can only read as extraordinary social skill. She also, according to those same chronicles, managed the financial and administrative affairs of the county of Boulogne almost entirely during her husband's multiple absences. The chronicles note this almost in passing as if it were entirely expected, which it was, because it was. Now you might be wondering something at this point, and it is a fair question. If these women were trained so comprehensively, if they were so clearly capable of managing estates, directing staff, practicing medicine, navigating legal disputes, and sometimes defending castles under siege, why did the legal system treat them as if they could do none of these things? Why the coverture laws? Why the restrictions? Why the insistence on female dependency and male authority when the lived reality was so obviously different? And the honest answer, the historically grounded answer, is that the legal system was not designed around what women were actually capable of. It was designed around what the feudal system needed, and the feudal system needed military service above everything else. Land in medieval Europe was held in exchange for military service. You got to keep your estate because you owed the king knights. Knights were men. Therefore, legally land had to flow to and through men because the whole point of land ownership was to produce armed fighters. A woman could not personally fulfill the military obligation that land ownership required. So legally she could not hold land in the primary sense. The system was built around a function she was excluded from, not around an assessment of her actual capabilities, which is why the gap between legal theory and daily reality in medieval noblewomen's lives was so enormous. The law said one thing, life required another, and quietly, competently, day after day, these women lived in that gap and made it work. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the education of a noblewoman, before we move on. Something small, but something that has stayed with me. The training in textile management. We tend to think of spinning and weaving as household chores, humble tasks. But in medieval Europe, textiles were not humble at all. They were one of the primary forms of stored wealth. A piece of Flemish wool cloth could be worth more than a horse. Silk from the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world was worth more still. And fine embroidery, the kind that appeared on ecclesiastical garments, on the borders of tapestries, on the ceremonial robes of the nobility, was a form of art that required years of specialized training and could be traded for land, for political favors, for the release of captive family members. The Bayeux Tapestry, which tells the story of the Norman conquest of England in 1066, is the most famous example of this tradition. It is nearly 70 meters long. It depicts more than 600 figures. It was almost certainly designed and produced by women, possibly under the direction of Bishop Odo of Bayeux, but stitched by skilled needlewomen whose names, of course, were never recorded. Textile management, knowing what you had, what it was worth, how to acquire more, how to protect it from theft or damage or damp, was a financial skill as much as a domestic one. And it was taught to girls of the nobility with the same seriousness as accounting and languages, because everything in the end was about resources, and resources in the end were what kept people alive. What I keep coming back to as I think about the education of these women is the particular kind of courage it required. Not the dramatic courage of a siege, not the visible courage of a commander on a wall, the quiet courage of someone who is trained for a role they're officially told they will never have, who learns everything anyway, who prepares for every contingency, who builds the skills and the knowledge and the networks that an entire household will one day depend on, and who does all of this in a world that is simultaneously saying, you're not the main character, you're just waiting. That is a particular kind of resilience, and it was built stone by stone in those drafty schoolrooms over those wax tablets, in those hours of language lessons and accounting practice and herbal preparation. Now that we understand how a noblewoman was made, how she was shaped and prepared and equipped, the next thing we need to understand is the world she stepped into when the gates closed behind her husband and she turned back to face the castle. Because the castle itself was not simply a place to live, it was a machine. A living, breathing, enormously complicated machine that required constant attention, constant decisions, and a particular kind of mind that could hold 100 moving pieces in focus at once. And in the part that follows, we're going to step inside that machine. We're going to walk through the granary, the great hall, the kitchens, the accounts room, and we're going to understand in very real and very specific terms exactly what it meant to run a medieval castle as a corporation in the middle of a war. The numbers alone will make your head spin a little, in the best possible way. There is a question I want to ask you before we go any further. Have you ever been responsible for feeding a large group of people? Not a dinner party, I mean truly large. A wedding maybe, a big family reunion. One of those events where you had to count heads and calculate quantities and figure out how much of everything to buy, and then you inevitably either ran out of the chicken or ended up with 17 pounds of potato salad that nobody touched. Now multiply that problem by about 300, and remove the grocery store, and add the fact that the wrong answer does not mean an awkward evening, it means people starve. That is where we're going tonight. We spent the last stretch of our story inside the schoolroom understanding how a noblewoman was educated and prepared. Now the gates have closed, the husband is gone, and she is standing in the middle of something that functions less like a home and more like a small city with all the logistical demands that implies. The word castle tends to conjure a very specific image. Stone towers, battlements, a moat if you're feeling theatrical. And yes, all of those things existed. But what the image almost never captures is the sheer density of activity happening inside those walls every single day. A functioning castle in 13th century England was simultaneously a military garrison, an agricultural processing centre, a law court, a hospital, a textile workshop, a treasury, a granary, a brewery, a bakery, a stable complex, and a diplomatic reception venue. All running at the same time, all dependent on each other, all ultimately dependent on one person to keep them from colliding. Let me walk you through what that actually looked like starting from the ground up. The physical structure of a medieval castle was designed around function far more than comfort. The ground floor of the main keep was almost entirely devoted to storage. Not storage in the modern sense, a closet, a garage, somewhere you put things you might need someday. Medieval castle storage was an operation unto itself. Salt. Enormous quantities of salt, because salt was the only reliable way to preserve meat through the winter months. Salted pork, salted beef, salted fish, barrels of it stacked carefully in the cool stone chambers. A castle that ran short on salt before winter ended was a castle that would be feeding its people rotting meat by February. That was not a hypothetical risk. It was a very real one, and the woman overseeing the stores knew exactly how many barrels she had and exactly how fast they were being depleted. Hard cheeses which could last months if stored correctly. Dried legumes, peas and beans, the protein staple of the medieval diet for everyone below a certain rank. Grains wheat for the fine bread served to the Lord's table, rye and barley for everyone else, oats for the horses. Casks of wine imported from France or the Rhine Valley reserved for the high table, and ale. Vast quantities of ale because, as I mentioned in passing earlier, the water supply in a medieval castle was frequently unsafe, drawn from wells that were far too close to the waste pits, and ale having been boiled in the brewing process was the safe alternative. Everyone drank it, children included. The ale was much weaker than modern beer, but still. The quantities required to keep several hundred people hydrated were staggering. One study of household accounts from a major English castle in the early 14th century found that the household consumed somewhere between 1 and 2 gallons of ale per person per day, for every man, woman and child on the estate. You do the arithmetic on 300 people, and then sit with that for a moment. Someone had to plan that. Someone had to commission the brewing store the barrels track the consumption, and ensure that the supply was replenished before it ran out, and that someone in the absence of the Lord was his wife. Now the castle did not exist in isolation, and this is one of the things that I think most modern imaginations miss entirely. A great noble house in medieval England did not typically own just one castle. It owned a network of estates manors scattered across multiple counties, each with its own agricultural land, its own tenants, its own production capabilities, its own local issues and disputes. The castle was the administrative centre, but it drew its resources from this entire web of properties, which meant the noblewoman was not just managing what was in front of her. She was managing something invisible, a system of relationships and obligations and supply chains that existed across sometimes vast distances in an era when the fastest communication moved at the speed of a horse. Let me give you a specific example that I think makes this vivid. Ela of Salisbury. She was born around 1191, roughly the same era as Nicola de la Haye, though in very different circumstances, and she became the Countess of Salisbury through her own hereditary right, not through her husband. When her husband William Longespee, an illegitimate son of King Henry II, died in 1226, Ela took full control of the earldom. What is remarkable about Ela is not that she managed her estates competently. It is the scope of what competent management actually meant in her case. Ela was responsible for the financial administration of Wiltshire through her role as sheriff. Yes, she served as Sheriff of Wiltshire, one of the very few women to hold that office in medieval England, which meant she was collecting royal taxes, administering royal justice, and managing the financial relationship between her county and the crown. She did this while simultaneously overseeing the agricultural output of multiple manors, managing a complex web of feudal obligations from her own tenants, and negotiating the political landscape of a kingdom that was during much of her widowhood in considerable turmoil. She also founded Lecoq Abbey in 1232, which she later joined as a nun, and eventually became its abbess. The abbey she founded still exists today. You can visit it. Parts of it have appeared in film adaptations of Pride and Prejudice and in the Harry Potter series. The woman who built it spent years running a medieval county before she ever put on a habit. History again almost forgot to mention her name. The agricultural cycle that underpinned all of this economic activity was itself an enormously complex management challenge, and the woman overseeing a large estate needed to understand it in intimate detail. The medieval agricultural year moved in roughly 4 phases, and each one made non-negotiable demands on both the land and the people working it. Autumn was harvest and slaughter. The grain had to come in, be threshed, be stored. Livestock that could not be fed through the winter because winter fodder was scarce and expensive had to be culled, the meat salted and stored. A miscalculation here, either keeping too many animals or too few, had consequences that would echo for months. Winter was the time of planning and preparation. Fields lay fallow. Farm workers were redirected to maintenance and construction. And in the castle, the grinding work of tracking stores assessing what had been consumed, projecting what would be needed, and calculating what would have to be purchased or traded for in the spring, happened in the accounts room by candlelight over ledgers and tallies. Spring was planting. The work of deciding what to plant where crop rotation was practiced in medieval England, with fields typically divided into thirds on a 3-year cycle, required knowledge of which fields had grown what the previous year, which were exhausted, which needed amendment, and how to sequence the labour force most efficiently across everything that needed to happen at once. Summer was tending, and then the whole cycle began again. Every phase required decisions that could not wait for a husband who was 600 miles away, on a campaign in France or the Holy Land. The frost did not pause for correspondence. The crops did not hold until the Lord returned. The livestock did not delay their needs for anyone's convenience. Here is something I find genuinely fascinating about the documentary evidence from this period. The pipe rolls, the annual accounting records of the English royal treasury maintained from the 12th century onward, occasionally contain entries that reveal noblewomen conducting financial business directly with the crown, paying feudal dues, rendering accounts, appearing in the official record as the responsible party for estates that nominally belong to their absent husbands. In the dry language of medieval Latin bookkeeping, these women appear as transactional agents, paying, receiving, negotiating in direct contradiction to the legal theory that said they had no such capacity. The law said she could not act independently. The pipe roll said she had just rendered 340 silver marks to the royal treasury on behalf of the earldom. Both things were apparently true at the same time, and nobody seems to have found that particularly remarkable, which tells you something important. The gap between what the law said and what actually happened was not a gap that anyone in power had much interest in closing, as long as the money kept flowing. The relationship between a noblewoman and her household steward deserves particular attention here because it was one of the most delicate and consequential relationships in the entire medieval social structure. The steward was the senior household officer. He was always male. He was usually from a respectable family, educated, experienced, and his job in theory was to manage the practical running of the estate on behalf of the Lord. In the Lord's absence, the dynamic shifted entirely. The steward technically outranked most of the household staff. He had access to the accounts, the records, the supply chains. He knew the tenants. He knew the merchants. He knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively speaking, and the noblewoman knew that he knew all of this. She also knew that her ability to manage the estate depended to a significant degree on his cooperation and his honesty. This meant that one of her most important daily tasks was maintaining her authority over a man who probably had more formal experience than she did in a way that was firm enough to prevent him from taking advantage, gracious enough to preserve his dignity, and shrewd enough to ensure that he remained loyal rather than resentful. It was a tightrope act, and the historical record gives us glimpses of what happened when it went wrong. Stewards who manipulated accounts for years before being caught, who formed alliances with hostile neighbours, who allowed estate discipline to collapse in ways that cost the family dearly. It also gives us glimpses of the ones who got it right. Long relationships of genuine mutual trust, stewards who wrote loyally to absent lords about how capably their wives were managing, who defended the estate's interests with the same diligence they would have shown to the Lord himself. The difference in almost every case came down to the same thing. Whether the noblewoman had established clearly and early that she understood exactly what was happening on her own estate. You cannot be cheated by someone who knows that you already know the answer to the question you're about to ask. That is not a medieval insight, by the way. That is just a human one. I want to close this section with a detail that I think captures the whole picture in a single image. In the surviving household accounts from several major English noble estates in the 13th and early 14th centuries, there is a recurring item that appears in the weekly expenditure records. It is listed alongside entries for grain purchased for candles, ordered for ale, brewed for wages paid. The item is ink and parchment. Ink and parchment purchased regularly in significant quantities. Because someone was writing. Someone was keeping records, sending letters, drafting instructions, maintaining the documentary infrastructure that a complex estate management system required. In the Lord's absence, that someone was the lady of the house, writing in Norman French to her husband's allies, writing in Latin to the castle clergyman, writing in English to the merchants and the local officials, maintaining the paper trail, or rather the parchment trail that kept everything legally and financially coherent, and every week more ink, more parchment. The quiet, unstoppable evidence of a woman running a corporation by candlelight in a world that had written her out of its own narrative. There is something almost poetic about that. The ink she used to do the work also happens to be the ink that in some small ways recorded that she did it. That evidence, those letters, those accounts, those fragments of correspondence, is going to become very important as our story develops. Because one of the most remarkable things about the way noblewomen navigated wartime was not just what they did inside the castle walls. It was how they stayed connected to a world that was in constant motion outside them, the communication systems they used, the intelligence networks they maintained, the letters they wrote and received across hundreds of miles in languages that were sometimes literally coded to husbands who were sometimes winning and sometimes losing, and sometimes already gone. That is where we are headed next, and I promise you the letters alone tell a story that no chronicle ever bothered to write down. Something about the way medieval people wrote letters has always gotten under my skin. Not the content exactly, not the formal Latin phrases or the elaborate courtesy titles, or the careful political language that fills so many of the surviving documents. What gets me is the silence around the edges, the things that were not written down but that you can feel pressing against the words that were. Read enough medieval letters from women to their absent husbands, and you start to notice a particular quality to them, a kind of controlled steadiness. The practical details come first, the estate business, the legal matters, the requests for specific items, and somewhere in the middle, almost buried, almost offhand, there is a line about the children, a line about the weather, a line that if you read it slowly enough sounds less like a letter, and more like someone trying very hard not to fall apart. That is where we are going in this part of our story. Not just to the logistics of medieval communication, though the logistics are genuinely fascinating, but to what those letters actually meant. What it cost to write them, what it meant to wait for one. Let us start with a physical reality because it is stranger than most people expect. Writing a letter in 12th or 13th century England was not like writing an email. It was not like writing a letter today for that matter. The process began with parchment, not paper, which was rare and expensive in northwestern Europe until the 14th century. But parchment made from stretched and dried animal skin, usually sheep or calf. A single sheet of parchment required an entire animal skin carefully prepared, scraped thin, dried under tension to produce a smooth writing surface. It was expensive, it was precious. Nobody wasted it. Which is one reason medieval letters were written so densely. Every inch of that surface was used. Margins were narrow, lines were close together. The writing itself was small and precise because ink was also a costly commodity, typically made from oak galls, the small round growths that appear on oak trees as a response to wasp activity, mixed with iron sulfate and gum arabic, to produce the characteristic dark brown black ink that has survived in those documents for 800 years. The letter once written was folded and sealed. The seal was not decorative. It was an authentication system. Each noble family had a unique seal, usually a carved stone or metal matrix that pressed an impression into hot wax. A broken seal on a received letter was a serious matter. It meant someone had read it. It meant the communication had been compromised. And then the letter was given to a messenger. Here is where the system becomes both ingenious and terrifying, depending on which end of it you were on. Medieval messengers were not a neutral postal service. They were people, usually young men, often servants of the household, sometimes minor clergymen who carried not just the letter, but their employer's reputation and security in their hands. A messenger who was captured by hostile forces brought everything with him, the letter, its contents, and usually a fairly accurate knowledge of where he had come from and where he was going, which meant that noblewomen writing to husbands on campaign in contested territory had to assume with every letter they sent that it might be read by the wrong person. This produced a fascinating set of adaptations. Some letters used coded references, not elaborate cryptographic systems, but a set of shared private understandings between husband and wife that would be meaningless to an outsider, a reference to a particular tenant's dispute that was actually a signal about military readiness, a question about a specific horse that contained information about available funds. The language of domestic management as a kind of camouflage for strategic communication. Other letters simply committed nothing sensitive to writing, relying instead on the messenger himself to carry the real information verbally. The letter was the cover. The conversation the messenger had been instructed to have upon delivery was the content. This was common enough that the surviving instructions to messengers, in cases where those instructions were also written down, usually in household accounts, sometimes read almost like scripts. The messenger was told exactly what to say, in what order, to whom, and how to respond to likely questions. He was in effect a human communication device carrying encrypted information that only the intended recipient knew how to decode. I find that remarkable, not just as a security system, but as evidence of how much these women were thinking about. Running the estate, managing the accounts, overseeing the agriculture, handling the legal disputes, and simultaneously maintaining an intelligence operation, because that is essentially what this was. Gathering information, processing it, deciding what to communicate, and how protecting the communication in transit. The person doing all of this was not a spy master. She was the lady of a castle in Norfolk or Wiltshire, sitting in her solar by candlelight, writing on expensive parchment with carefully mixed ink, choosing every word with the awareness that the wrong word in the wrong hands could cost her family everything. Now, I want to tell you about Margaret Paston, and I want to tell you properly because she deserves more than a passing mention. Margaret was born around 1423 in Norfolk, England, into a family called the Mountbys, respectable gentry, reasonably prosperous, not particularly famous. She married John Paston, a lawyer and landowner, in 1440, and from roughly that point until her death in 1484, Margaret Paston wrote letters, not occasionally, constantly. The collection known as the Paston Letters, the largest surviving archive of personal correspondence from a single medieval English family, contains more letters from Margaret than from any other member of the family. We have documentation from her across approximately 40 years of her life, 40 years of her voice more or less unfiltered preserved in the British Library. Reading those letters is one of the more extraordinary experiences available to anyone interested in what medieval life actually felt like from the inside. Margaret's husband John was frequently absent. He spent long periods in London managing legal affairs in court, navigating the complex disputes that plagued the family's land claims during the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. And during all of those absences, Margaret ran everything: the estates in Norfolk, the legal battles that kept erupting locally, the constant pressure from powerful neighbours who wanted the Paston lands and were not shy about using intimidation to get them. She wrote to John constantly. The letters are practical, precise, sometimes urgent, occasionally exasperated, in a way that feels very recognisable 8 centuries later. In one famous letter from 1448, Margaret described a situation that had become what she called a virtual siege. The family's fortified manor house at Gresham had been occupied by the supporters of a local lord named Robert Hungerford, who was contesting the Paston claim to the property. Margaret found herself in the house with a small household, surrounded by hostile forces, not entirely sure whether an actual assault was coming. She wrote to John asking for crossbows, poleaxes armour for the servants, and bolts for the crossbows. The request was specific, practical, and urgent. She knew what she needed, and she named it precisely. And then at the very end of the letter, almost as an afterthought tucked into the final lines, she asked him also to send a pound of almonds and a pound of sugar. A pound of almonds, a pound of sugar. In the middle of asking for weapons to defend herself against a potential armed assault. Historians have been charmed by that detail for decades, and I understand why. On the surface it looks almost comic, the medieval equivalent of adding milk to your shopping list while requesting a shotgun. But I think there is something deeper in it than comedy. I think Margaret Paston knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote those final lines. She had assessed the situation. She'd requested the necessary military supplies with clear-eyed competence. And then she had added the almonds and the sugar because life continued to require almonds and sugar, regardless of who was threatening the walls. Because normalcy, the maintenance of ordinary life in the face of extraordinary pressure, was itself a form of defiance. A refusal to let fear define the entire picture. Or possibly she just really needed almonds. Medieval cooking used them constantly as a thickening agent and a base for sauces. Either way, I am fond of her for it. The letter worked, incidentally. The crisis was eventually resolved. The Pastons kept the property at least temporarily in the perpetual land disputes of 15th century England. Nothing was ever resolved permanently. Margaret went on to defend other properties, manage other crises, write hundreds more letters. She raised children during a civil war. She buried a husband. She navigated the most turbulent decades in 15th century English political life from a manor house in Norfolk, armed with ink parchment and a very clear understanding of what she needed and when she needed it. Now, let us step back from England for a moment and look at a different corner of the same world. Because the wartime communication challenges faced by noblewomen were not unique to one country or one conflict. They were a structural feature of medieval aristocratic life across Europe, and the ways different women navigated them tell us something important about how universal this particular form of competence was. Eleanor of Aquitaine and I want to be careful here not to reduce her to a footnote because she is one of the most genuinely remarkable figures in all of medieval history, provides one of the most vivid examples of wartime correspondence at the highest possible level. Eleanor was born around 1122 in Aquitaine, in what is now southwestern France. She inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine at 15, making her one of the wealthiest landowners in Europe before she'd finished growing. She married King Louis VII of France, travelled with him on the Second Crusade in 1147, and 1148 eventually had that marriage annulled, and then married King Henry II of England, becoming Queen of England within weeks of her annulment from the French king. Her correspondence during the Crusade is particularly striking. Eleanor travelled with Louis to the Holy Land, one of relatively few queens to do so, and her letters from that period where they survive or are referenced in contemporary accounts show a woman processing extremely complex information about military situations, political alliances, and personal safety simultaneously. She was not at home waiting for letters. She was in the field writing them from the middle of the situation. After her marriage to Henry deteriorated, Eleanor spent 16 years imprisoned in the various English castles, a subject for another conversation entirely. But the letters she wrote during that imprisonment and the diplomatic correspondence she conducted through intermediaries demonstrate something important, that the communication skills these women developed were not conditional on favourable circumstances. They functioned under pressure, under restriction, under conditions that most of us would find paralysing. Eleanor never stopped gathering information, never stopped writing, never stopped working the network even from inside a locked room. There is a particular phrase that appears in various forms in several medieval letters from noblewomen to their husbands on campaign, and it has stayed with me since I first encountered it in a historical study some years ago. The phrase translated roughly from the Norman French is something like, "I write to you as often as I am able, and I pray that my letters reach you before the news does." Before the news does. Think about what that means for a moment. In a world without telegraphs, without radio, without any fast communication whatsoever, the news of a battle's outcome might travel faster than a single letter, carried by a fleeing soldier, by a rumour passed from village to village by a merchant who had been near enough to the fighting to see something. And a wife sitting in her castle might hear that her husband's army had been destroyed days before she received the last letter he wrote. She was always writing into uncertainty, always sending words toward a man who might by the time those words arrived be a prisoner, or wounded, or gone, and knowing that she wrote anyway, every week sometimes more. The practical estate updates the requests for instructions, the reports on the children, the careful navigation of local political situations. She wrote because the letters were the connection, and maintaining the connection was the only thing she could control. I think about the weight of that sometimes, the discipline it required. To write clearly, to think practically, to keep the household running, and the letters flowing when every morning you woke up not knowing whether the person you were writing to was still alive. That is not just competence. That is a particular quality of character that I am not sure we have a good word for. Steadiness, maybe. The kind of steadiness that does not come from certainty, but from choosing deliberately to function in its absence. The letters these women wrote are some of the most human documents to survive from the medieval period. Not because they are dramatic, though some of them are, but because in their very practicality in the request for crossbows alongside almonds, in the careful estate reports, alongside the brief tender lines about missing someone, you can feel a whole life being held together by the force of one person's will. And that, as we are about to see, was only one dimension of what these women carried. Because while the letters were going out and the estate accounts were being tallied and the ale barrels were being counted, something else was also happening inside those castle walls, something that rarely makes it into the history books at all, even the good ones, the medicine, the healing, the daily confrontation with illness, injury, and the particular kind of loss that comes not from battle but from the simple brutal randomness of medieval life. That is the part of this story that perhaps reveals more about who these women truly were than anything else we have discussed so far. And it is where we are headed next. Close your eyes for just a second and imagine this. It is 3 a.m. The castle is as quiet as it ever gets, which is to say, not entirely quiet because stone walls carry sound in ways that wood never does, and somewhere in the courtyard a horse is restless, and a dog is responding to something only it can hear. But the great hall is still. The kitchens are dark, and somewhere in the upper rooms there is a light, a single candle, or maybe 2, a woman bent over a work table grinding something in a small stone mortar. The smell in that room is complex, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, something sharp and green, something earthy and medicinal, faintly sweet underneath it all from the dried flowers. On the shelf beside her a locked wooden chest stands open. Inside it rows of small cloth packets and ceramic jars, each one labelled in a careful hand. She is not a physician. There is no physician for 50 miles. There may not be a physician for 100 miles who would come to a place like this for anything short of the Lord himself lying on his deathbed. She is what there is. And tonight one of the kitchen workers has a wound that is beginning to show the wrong kind of colour. A farm labourer came in 2 days ago with a deep gash from a scythe, and she's been checking it morning and evening, and tonight the edge of it has gone red in a way that means something needs to change. She knows what to try. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers, who learned it from the women who kept those notes in the monastery herbals 3 generations back. She does not call it science. She calls it what she knows, and she gets to work. We promised you the medicine in the last part of our story, and medicine is where we're going to stay for a while now, because I think it is one of the most underappreciated aspects of what Noblewomen actually did. It is also one of the areas where the gap between historical reputation and historical reality is most startling. When most people think about medieval medicine, they think about the things that went wrong. The bloodletting, the miasma theory, the prayers offered over infected wounds while the patient died anyway. And yes, all of that happened. Medieval medicine had real limitations and some genuinely harmful practices. I am not going to romanticize it, but there was another tradition running alongside the academic medicine of the universities, one that was older and in many ways more practically effective, and it lived almost entirely in the hands of women, specifically in the hands of noblewomen and the female religious communities, the abbesses and nuns who maintained the great monastic herb gardens of medieval Europe. That tradition had a name, loosely speaking. Historians sometimes call it empirical herbalism medicine, based not on the theoretical humoral systems of ancient Greek philosophy that dominated university training, but on careful accumulated observation of what actually worked. What reduced fever? What stopped infection from spreading? What eased the pain of a broken bone? What helped a woman survive childbirth? It was practical knowledge passed down in written form in manuscripts called herbals, and in oral form from experienced woman to apprentice, in exactly the same way that the household accounting knowledge and the textile management knowledge were passed down. The most remarkable figure in this entire tradition, and one who I think deserves far more mainstream recognition than she typically gets, is Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard was born in 1098 in the Rhine Valley in what is now Germany. She entered religious life as a child, eventually became the abbess of her own monastery at Rupertsberg, and over the course of her extraordinarily long and productive life, she died in 1179 at the age of 81. She produced a body of work that covered theology, music, natural science, and medicine. Her medical writings, particularly a work known as Physica, and another called Causae et Curae, which translates roughly as Causes and Cures, are some of the most comprehensive medical texts to survive from the 12th century. And what makes them remarkable is not just their scope, but their methodology. Hildegard wrote about the medicinal properties of plants, minerals, and animals based on systematic observation. She described symptoms, causes, and treatments with a specificity that was genuinely unusual for her era. She wrote about the use of certain plants for what we would now recognize as digestive disorders, infections, and neurological symptoms. She wrote about diet and its relationship to health in ways that anticipate ideas that would not appear in mainstream European medicine for another several centuries. She described the effects of what she called viriditas, greenness, vitality, the life force present in healthy plants and healthy bodies, in terms that sound almost like an early intuition of the concept we now associate with immune function. Was everything she wrote correct by modern standards? No. Of course not. She lived in the 12th century without microscopes, without germ theory, without any of the frameworks that modern medicine depends on, but a striking number of her plant-based recommendations align with what contemporary pharmacological research has confirmed about the active compounds in those plants. Fennel for digestive complaints, feverfew for headaches, and modern clinical trials have confirmed that feverfew contains a compound called parthenolide that is genuinely effective in reducing the frequency of migraines. Plantain leaf as an antimicrobial for wounds confirmed. Valerian for anxiety and sleeplessness confirmed, though we now understand the neurological mechanism she had no way of knowing. She was not guessing any more than the women who inherited her tradition were guessing. They were working with an accumulated empirical database. They were in the truest sense practicing evidence-based medicine evidence gathered over generations without laboratories written down in margins and herbals, and the careful annotations of people who had watched things work or fail to work and had noted the difference. The noblewomen who managed castle households were not Hildegard. Most of them did not write medical treatises, but they inherited her tradition directly or indirectly, through the manuscripts that circulated through noble and religious households, through the instruction of older women, and through their own experience of watching what happened when they tried something and what happened when they did not. Their medical chest that locked apothecary cabinet on the keyring was the physical embodiment of this inherited knowledge, and its contents were surprisingly sophisticated. Let me tell you what a well-stocked medieval noblewoman's medical supplies might actually contain, because I think the specifics are illuminating. Comfrey root dried and powdered for bruising and fractures. The active compound allantoin promotes cell proliferation. Essentially, it speeds up the process by which damaged tissue repairs itself. Applied as a poultice over a broken bone or a deep bruise, it worked. We know this now because we have analysed it in laboratories. Medieval women knew it then because they had watched it work for centuries. Garlic. Medieval herbals are almost unanimous on garlic's value as an antimicrobial, and this one, if anything, is undersold. Allicin, the active compound in garlic, is a genuinely powerful, broad-spectrum antimicrobial. Applied to an infected wound, it could slow or stop the spread of infection in ways that were genuinely life-saving before the age of antibiotics. Honey. Raw honey has extraordinary antimicrobial properties because of its high sugar content, low moisture, and the hydrogen peroxide produced by its enzymatic activity. Applied to wounds, it creates an environment in which most bacteria cannot survive. Medieval healers did not know why honey worked on wounds. They just knew that it did, and they used it constantly. Wormwood for intestinal parasites effective. Elderflower for fever reduction effective. Poppy preparations for pain effective and also in high doses potentially dangerous, which the better herbals were careful to note. This was not witchcraft. It was not superstition. It was a pharmacopoeia that worked within its limitations, and that the women who maintained it understood with a sophistication that the sneering academic physicians of the medieval universities almost never acknowledged. Here is something that I find genuinely darkly funny about medieval medical history. The university-trained physicians, all male, trained in the Latin texts of Galen and Avicenna, deeply invested in the theoretical framework of the four humours, frequently dismissed the herbal traditions practiced by women as folk medicine beneath serious consideration. And yet, when the Black Death swept through Europe in 1347 through 1351, killing somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of Europe, in roughly 5 years, it was not the university physicians who managed the practical response at the community level. They mostly fled, or died, or wrote theoretical treatises about miasma and corrupted air while the patients piled up outside. It was the women, the noble women on their estates, the religious women in their monasteries, the experienced healers in the villages who stayed, who tried things, who developed isolation practices not because they understood germ theory, but because they had observed empirically that people who were near the sick tended to become sick themselves, and that separating the affected from the healthy appeared to slow the spread. Some historians have argued that the medieval practice of quarantine, which predates the formal development of germ theory by 5 centuries, emerged substantially from the observed practices of women managing disease outbreaks at the household level. I find that argument persuasive, but the medicine that a noblewoman practiced was not only about infectious disease. There was another dimension of it that was in some ways even more demanding, even more intimate: childbirth. In medieval Europe, childbirth was the leading cause of death for women, between the ages of roughly 15 and 45. Not war, not famine, not plague, though all of those took their toll. Childbirth. The very thing that the entire social system demanded of noblewomen as their primary function. The mathematics were brutal. A noblewoman in the 13th century might be pregnant 8, 10, 12 times over the course of her adult life. Each pregnancy carried real risk, complications that today would be managed with a surgical procedure or an intravenous medication could and frequently did become fatal. Hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labour, eclampsia, though they did not have that word for it. And the woman responsible for managing childbirth on a castle estate was not a trained obstetrician. She was the lady of the house, or the most experienced woman available, working with the knowledge in her herbal manuscripts, and whatever she had personally witnessed and learned. She was also not infrequently facing her own pregnancies. At the same time, she was managing everyone else's. There is a particular kind of courage embedded in that reality that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. Not the courage of a battle, which has a visible enemy and a clear objective. The courage of continuing to function, continuing to provide care, continuing to make decisions for other people's lives and deaths, while carrying your own vulnerability right alongside it. Hildegard of Bingen wrote about women's health with a frankness that was unusual for her era, and one of the things she wrote about was the particular physical and emotional demands of pregnancy and childbirth on noblewomen who were also managing households. She was not sentimental about it. She was practical. She described specific preparations for easing labour, for managing the aftermath of difficult births, for supporting the recovery of women who had come close to not surviving. She wrote in effect as someone who had seen what happened and was trying to help. The image of medieval women as passive recipients of a medical system controlled entirely by men is one of the more persistent and more incorrect assumptions in popular history. The reality is that for the majority of people in medieval Europe, everyone outside the immediate orbit of the very wealthy and large cities, women were the medical system. There was no alternative, and the knowledge those women carried, the care they delivered, and the lives they preserved through competence and accumulated wisdom is a chapter of history that has been quietly erased by the simple fact that those women, like so many others, were not considered worth writing about. The herbal survived, though. The manuscripts circulated. The locked medical chests were passed from mother to daughter, alongside the accounting ledgers and the key rings. The knowledge persisted generation to generation in the same quiet, determined way that these women persisted themselves. There is one more dimension of the medical role that I want to mention before we move on, and it is one that I think speaks to something deeper than technique or knowledge. When a castle was functioning in wartime with the lord away, and the household reduced and the normal structures of authority and support thinned out, the noble woman who acted as healer was also inevitably acting as something else, as the person who held the space around illness and death, the person who sat with someone who was not going to recover and stayed, the person who managed the grief of the household when a child died of fever, or a young knight came back from training exercises with an injury that turned in the wrong direction. That is not medical knowledge. That is pastoral care. And it was also part of the job. I keep thinking about that candle in the upper room burning at 3 a.m. The woman grinding something in the stone mortar, checking the colour of a wound, making a decision. She was not remarkable by the standards of her own time. She was doing what was expected of her, what she'd been trained for, what hundreds of women across the medieval world were doing on the same night in the same way, with the same combination of knowledge and care and quiet determination. But here is something that connects everything we have been talking about, the accounts, the letters, the medicine, into a single thread. None of it happened in a vacuum of calm. It happened in a legal world that was at almost every turn actively working against these women. A world where they had almost no formal rights, where their ability to act was technically contingent on a husband's permission that was not available because the husband was several hundred miles away being shot at. The law was not their friend, and yet, as we're about to discover, these women navigated it with a sophistication and a creativity that genuinely rivals anything happening in the royal courts at the same time. Because when you have no legal standing and everything depends on you anyway, you develop a particular kind of relationship with the rules. You learn which ones can be bent, which ones can be worked around, and occasionally, in the most spectacular cases, which ones can be walked up to, looked directly in the eye, and simply defied. That is the story waiting for us in the next part of this journey. The law in medieval England had a particular quality that I think is worth naming plainly before we go any further. It was not designed to be fair. It was designed to be stable. Those are very different things. Stability in the feudal sense meant maintaining the flow of military service upward and the flow of land and revenue downward in a hierarchy that had been calibrated over generations. Fairness in the sense of treating people according to their actual capabilities, their actual contributions, their actual needs was not really the point. The point was that the system kept running, and if the system ran partly on the invisible, unacknowledged labour of women who technically had no legal existence, well, the records did not need to reflect that. The system just needed to keep running. But here is the thing about systems built on invisible labour. Eventually, the invisible people develop an intimate knowledge of the machinery. They learn where the gears are. They learn which levers move which parts. And they learn quietly, carefully over time how to make the machinery do things it was not originally designed to do. That is the story of the next hour of our evening together. Let me start with something that surprises almost everyone who encounters it. For the first time, the degree to which medieval noblewomen used legal proxies as a workaround for their own lack of legal standing. Under coverture, a married woman could not appear in court in her own name, could not sign contracts, could not initiate legal proceedings. This was not a loophole, it was the fundamental architecture of the legal system. The husband was the legal person. The wife was in the eyes of the law an extension of him. So what happened when the husband was unavailable, when he was on crusade or on campaign in France, or imprisoned by a hostile lord, or simply dead, and the estate had not yet been formally transferred? The answer in practice was the appointment of an attorney. Not an attorney in the modern sense, a trained legal professional. In medieval usage, an attorney was simply a person formally empowered to act on behalf of another. And the records of the Curia Regis, the royal court, roles that documented legal proceedings in medieval England, many of which survive from the late 12th century onward, show noblewomen appointing male attorneys to represent their interests in court, with a regularity that becomes almost mundane once you start looking for it. A husband would formally appoint his wife as his attorney, before leaving for war, giving her the legal authority to act in his name while he was absent. Or a widow, who briefly held full legal standing between marriages, would appoint a trusted male agent to navigate proceedings she was technically permitted to initiate, but practically unable to attend in person. It was a workaround. It was legal ventriloquism, in a sense, the woman's voice coming out of a male mouth because the court would not listen to her own. And it worked. The Curia Regis roles are full of cases where women drove the legal strategy, wrote the instructions, made the decisions, and had it all executed by a proxy, whose name appears in the record while hers does not. This is one of the reasons medieval women are so difficult to find in the legal record. They are there, but they are operating behind intermediaries, and the intermediaries are what got written down. Now, I want to tell you about dower rights, because this is where things get genuinely interesting, and in a way that I find both admirable and slightly devious, where some of the most creative legal manoeuvring happened. A widow in medieval England was legally entitled to dower a share of her deceased husband's estate, typically set at 1/3 of his land and property. This right was established by Magna Carta in 1215, specifically in Clause 7, which stated that a widow should receive her dower promptly and without payment, and should not be forced to remarry. On paper, this was a significant protection. In practice, obtaining it was frequently a years-long legal battle. The problem was this: the estate a woman's husband had held was immediately claimed by his male heir, his eldest son, his brother, his closest male relative. That heir had every incentive to delay the widow's dower claim as long as possible, because every month she was not receiving her third was a month he was collecting the full income from the estate. And the legal system, while technically obligated to enforce her right, moved slowly and could be influenced by men with money and connections in ways that a recently widowed woman, even a noble one, frequently could not match. The response of many noblewomen to this situation was to prepare for it long before it arrived. This is something that the household accounts and private correspondence from the period reveal when you read them carefully. Women who had been managing their husbands' estates for years, tracking the income, knowing the asset values, understanding the tenant relationships, arrived at widowhood with a level of financial intelligence that made it extremely difficult to cheat them out of their share. They knew what the estate was worth. They knew what the rent should be. They knew which properties had been improved under their management and which had been neglected, and they had in many cases been quietly cultivating relationships with local legal officials and church authorities for years, not because they were planning ahead for widowhood necessarily, but because those relationships were useful for running the estate. It just turned out they were also very useful for fighting a legal battle afterward. Isabella de Fours is perhaps the most striking example of what a noblewoman could accomplish once she was legally free to act in her own name. We touched on her in passing in the very first part of our story. I mentioned her as an example of the widowhood as a path to autonomy. But she deserves a much fuller look here. Isabella was born in 1237. Her father was the Count of Devon. Her mother was the Countess of Aumale. In her own right, Isabella inherited both titles, making her one of the wealthiest individuals in England at the time of her father's death, male or female. She married William de Fours, the Earl of Albemarle, when she was approximately 13. He died in 1261 when Isabella was 24, leaving her with young children and control of an enormous complex of estates spanning several English counties, and including Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight. Isabella never remarried. That decision was by the standards of her time extraordinary. She was wealthy, well-connected, young enough to bear more children and controlling property that powerful men very much wanted access to. The pressure to remarry from the crown, from neighbouring lords, from her own extended family must have been considerable. Widows of her status were valuable commodities in the marriage market. They came with land, with connections with established household networks. She refused, repeatedly, for 32 years. Instead, she litigated, constantly. The legal record of the 13 decades of Isabella's widowhood is a remarkable document of sustained legal engagement. She appeared in court through her attorneys in case after case. She negotiated directly with King Edward I on multiple occasions regarding her estates, her rights, and her obligations to the crown. She managed the defence of Carisbrooke Castle, which required ongoing investment and maintenance. She negotiated the terms of her children's marriages with a hard-headedness that contemporaries noted with a combination of admiration and exasperation. She was by any reasonable assessment one of the most powerful individuals in England during the latter half of the 13th century, not because of any formal title or official role, but because she controlled land, understood the law well enough to use it, and had the intelligence and the nerve to act on both. When she died in 1293, she was the last of her line. Her estates reverted to the crown. Edward I reportedly said upon receiving news of her death that he had lost one of the greatest ladies of England. He was right. He was also, it must be said, probably relieved. Because Isabella de Fours had spent 32 years being very expensive to have as an adversary. Here is a question worth sitting with. Why do we not know her name the way we know the names of the kings and lords she outmaneuvered for 3 decades? The answer is partly the one we've been circling around all evening, that the chronicles were written by men with different interests recording different kinds of power. But I think there is something else as well. Isabella's power was in a technical sense exceptional. She wielded it in ways that were permitted only because she was a widow in a narrow legal window that closed the moment she would have remarried. The system was not designed to produce people like her. She was an edge case, a woman who happened to have the right combination of inherited wealth, intelligence, legal timing, and sheer stubbornness to operate at a level the system had not quite planned for. The women we've been talking about throughout this whole story, the ones managing estates, writing letters, practicing medicine, raising children in wartime, they were not edge cases. They were the norm. They were doing exactly what the system required of them, just without any of the legal standing or historical recognition that would have accompanied the same work done by a man. And that, I think, is the more uncomfortable truth. Not that exceptional women occasionally broke through the barriers and achieved remarkable things. History is fairly comfortable with that narrative. The more uncomfortable truth is that ordinary women, thousands and thousands of them, did the essential work of medieval civilization every day competently and without recognition, while the legal and social system around them insisted they were incapable of independent action. The church courts deserve a mention here because they were another space separate from the royal courts operating under canon law rather than common law, where women sometimes found slightly more room to maneuver. Canon law, the legal framework of the medieval Catholic Church, did not recognize coverture in the same way that English common law did. A woman could appear in a church court in her own name. She could initiate proceedings. She could testify. The Church's interest in marriage inheritance and the welfare of widows and orphans created a set of legal mechanisms that noblewomen learned to use strategically. A dispute about dower rights that was going badly in the royal courts might be reframed as a question about the validity of a marriage contract and brought to a church tribunal instead. A conflict about the custody of children, which in secular law would typically be decided entirely in favour of the male heir, might be argued through ecclesiastical channels with different results. This legal forum shopping, as modern lawyers would call it, was practiced by noblewomen with a sophistication that suggests they understood the difference between the two systems very well. They were not stumbling into church courts accidentally. They were choosing them deliberately in cases where the church's jurisdiction offered a more favourable framework. The ability to read a legal landscape and choose the most advantageous terrain is not naive. It is strategic. It is exactly what their husbands were doing on the battlefield, assessing the ground, choosing the position, deploying resources where they would have the most effect. The battlefield just happened to be a courtroom, and the weapon was knowledge. I want to close this part of our story with a moment that has stayed with me since I first read about it. In the records of the Curia Regis from the early 13th century, there is an entry one line almost lost among hundreds of other entries that records a noblewoman appearing through her attorney to claim her dower rights against an estate that her husband's family had been withholding for nearly 2 years. The case had been argued, delayed, argued again, and delayed again. The opposing side had better connections, more resources, and significantly more experience in royal court proceedings. The noblewoman won. The record notes the outcome without comment, no explanation of how it was achieved, no acknowledgement of the 2 years of legal persistence. It had required no recognition of the fact that this woman had been running the family's estate single-handedly Throughout the entire dispute, feeding and managing and medicating and writing and organizing while simultaneously fighting a legal battle in her husband's name for property she was legally entitled to but had not been permitted to touch. Just a line. And then the next case. But she won. And in that small, unremarkable, completely undramatic line in a court roll from 8 centuries ago, there is something that I find quietly extraordinary. The system was not built for her. The law was not on her side. The connections, the resources, and the official language of power all belonged to someone else. She won anyway. That quality, that specific combination of preparation and patience and strategic intelligence, and refusal to simply accept what the system said she deserved, is something we are going to see again in a context that is dramatically more vivid than a court record. Because the next chapter of this story takes us somewhere the legal manoeuvring and the letter writing and the account keeping were only a rehearsal for. It takes us to the castle walls themselves when the enemy was no longer a hostile lawyer with better court connections but an actual army at the gate. And the women who met them there, the ones who organized the defense, commanded the garrison, and held the walls, are people whose names history came very close to losing entirely. We're about to make sure that does not happen. Somewhere in the middle of writing this story, I realized something that stopped me for a moment. Every single thing we have talked about so far, the keys, the accounts, the medicine, the letters, the legal battles, all of it was happening while these women were also simultaneously raising children. Not raising children in the calm, relatively protected way we tend to imagine when we think of childhood. Raising children in a world where child mortality before the age of 5 ran at somewhere between 30 and 50%, depending on the decade and the epidemic cycle. Raising children while managing an estate under wartime conditions, while their fathers were absent for years at a time, while the political landscape around the family shifted in ways that could make a child's entire future. Their marriage prospects, their land inheritance, their social standing contingent on decisions being made on a battlefield hundreds of miles away, and doing all of this while in many cases not knowing from one letter to the next whether the children's father was still alive. That is the dimension of this story I want to sit with tonight. Not the logistics, not the legal maneuvering, the human weight of it. What it actually meant to be a mother in this particular kind of world under this particular kind of pressure. Let us start with something that tends to surprise people: the speed at which medieval noble children were expected to move from infancy into something resembling adult responsibility. A girl of the nobility, as we discussed in an earlier part of our story, might be betrothed before she was 5. A boy, the precious male heir, the one whose survival the entire family structure depended on, was typically sent away from his mother's household by the time he was 7 or 8 years old. Sent away. To another noble household, usually a more powerful one than his own, to begin his training as a page and eventually a squire. This was not considered cruel by medieval standards. It was considered essential. The bonds of loyalty that held the feudal system together were forged in these early placements. A boy who grew up in the household of a great lord became that lord's man in a way that ran deeper than simple obligation. He had eaten the lord's bread. He had learned to ride in the lord's stables. He had watched how power was exercised from the inside. But from the mother's perspective, it meant that the child she had carried delivered at considerable personal risk, nursed through the fevers and falls and illnesses of early childhood. That child was gone before his voice had broken, sent to become someone else's household member, in preparation for a life that would look in its essentials exactly like his father's, including the part where he would go to war. I think about the particular shape of that grief sometimes. Not the sharp grief of death, though. Medieval mothers knew that grief intimately, because many of them buried children before they ever got to send them away. But the longer, quieter grief of preparing a child for a world that would consume him in the same way it was consuming his father, of being good at the preparation because that was the only protection you could offer, and knowing the protection was partial at best. The wet nurse system adds another layer to this picture that is worth understanding, because it shaped the emotional geography of noble childhood in ways that still reverberate through how we think about medieval family life. Noble women of the higher aristocracy typically did not breastfeed their own children. Wet nurses, women from lower social classes who were nursing their own infants and had milk to spare, were employed to feed noble babies. This was standard practice, almost universal at the upper levels of the nobility, and it had practical reasons that made sense in the context of the time. A nursing woman was less likely to conceive. In an era when the political pressure to produce heirs was intense and constant, the sooner a noblewoman's fertility returned after a birth, the better from the family's strategic perspective. The wet nurse allowed the noblewoman to return to reproductive availability faster than breastfeeding would permit. It also meant that a noblewoman who had just given birth was not primarily a feeding mother in the physical sense. She was an organizational mother, the person who ensured the baby was being properly cared for, who monitored the wet nurse's health and behavior, who managed the nursery as one more complex system within the larger household system she was running. Whether or not this created emotional distance is a question historians debate. The evidence cuts both ways. Some medieval mothers write about their children with a warmth and specificity that is unmistakably personal. Others seem to regard their children primarily through the lens of political utility, which heir was most valuable, which daughter could be deployed in which alliance, which child's death was most strategically costly. Both responses were probably real. The medieval nobility was not a monolith of cold calculation, any more than it was a monolith of tender sentiment. These were human beings navigating impossible circumstances, and they responded to those circumstances with the full range of human emotion. What I find most interesting, though, is what happened to those emotions in the specific context of wartime. When the father was gone and the mother was the only parent present, when the children were old enough to understand that something was wrong but not old enough to understand the full scope of it, when a letter arrived with news that required a response and the response had to project stability because the entire household, children, servants, tenants, knights was watching to see how the lady of the house was going to take it. The face that a noblewoman showed in those moments was not necessarily the face she was feeling, and maintaining the gap between those two faces day after day was its own kind of invisible labour. Blanche of Castile is the figure who inhabits this part of the story most completely, and I want to spend some time with her because she is one of the most remarkable women in medieval European history and one of the most misrepresented. Blanche was born in 1188 in Palencia in the Kingdom of Castile. She was the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose name has appeared several times in our story already, and she inherited by all accounts a considerable portion of her grandmother's formidable intelligence and political instinct. At the age of 12, Blanche was sent to France to marry the future King Louis VIII. It was a diplomatic marriage brokered by her grandmother Eleanor, who personally travelled to Castile to select which of Blanche's sisters would make the best French queen. Eleanor chose Blanche. Louis VIII died in 1226, leaving Blanche the regent of France for their 12-year-old son, who would become King Louis IX, later canonised as St. Louis. What followed was one of the most extraordinary regencies in medieval European history, and it is at its heart a story about a mother navigating one of the most dangerous political situations imaginable, while simultaneously raising a child to be a king. The challenge Blanche faced was not merely administrative. Immediately after Louis VIII's death, a coalition of French barons attempted to seize control of the regency, arguing that a woman, a foreign-born woman at that, was not capable of governing France on behalf of the young king. They were not subtle about it. Several of them staged military demonstrations. One of them, Hugh X of Lusignan, actually attempted to capture the young king in 1227. Blanche, with her 12-year-old son, was travelling when she received word of the ambush. She turned back to Paris. She summoned the citizens of Paris to escort the king. Thousands came. The barons backed down. That is a remarkable moment. A widowed foreign queen with a child who was technically in danger mobilizing civilian support in a country that was not her birthplace to face down a coalition of armed and hostile nobles, and doing it fast enough, decisively enough that the threat collapsed before it could materialize. What did that require? Every skill we have talked about through this entire story. The communication networks to get the message to Paris quickly. The political relationships she'd been building since her arrival in France as a 12-year-old bride. The authority she had established as regent in the month since her husband's death. The ability to read a threat accurately and respond to it at the speed the situation required without the luxury of consulting anyone who outranked her. She spent the next decade governing France. She put down 2 baronial revolts. She negotiated the Treaty of Paris in 1229, which ended the Albigensian Crusade and brought the county of Toulouse under the French crown. She managed the royal finances, conducted diplomacy with the papacy and with neighbouring kingdoms, and simultaneously oversaw the education of a son who under her guidance became one of the most respected rulers in medieval French history. Louis IX adored his mother. He also by some accounts found her somewhat overwhelming. Contemporary chroniclers noted that Blanche maintained an extremely close oversight of her son's life, even after he came of age, including notoriously his relationship with his wife Margaret of Provence, which Blanche apparently regarded as a distraction from governance, and attempted to manage with a directness that Margaret found intrusive. There is something almost recognizable in that. The mother who cannot quite step back from the management role, even when the child no longer needs managing. The habits of a regency practiced for years, not easily dissolved when the official justification for them ends. But it also speaks to something real about what Blanche had invested in her son's formation. She had raised him in the most literal sense to be a king. Every lesson, every example, every political decision she had made with him, watching all of it, had been pointed at the same goal, and the goal had been achieved. Louis IX ruled for 44 years, and was eventually made a saint. His mother had built that. The emotional cost of that project is something we can only speculate about. But Blanche's letters, and a number survive, carry a quality that I find moving. She writes with clarity and authority about political matters, and occasionally in the margins of the political there is something quieter. A line about her health, a reference to fatigue, a note about missing something or someone that is left carefully unspecified. The face she showed the world was the regent's face. The face in the letters occasionally is something more human than that. Let me come back down from the heights of royal regency for a moment and think about the experience of a more ordinary noblewoman managing children in wartime, because Blanche's situation, while extraordinary in scale, was not unusual in structure. Across England and France and the Holy Roman Empire, hundreds of women were doing a smaller version of the same thing every decade of the medieval period. Managing children's grief and confusion in the absence of their fathers, maintaining the authority of the absent lord through the visible stability of the lady of the house, making decisions about their children's futures, marriages, placements, educations that would have been made jointly with a husband in ordinary times, but now fell entirely to them. One of the more poignant dimensions of this from a historical perspective is the question of children as political hostages. It was not uncommon in medieval political practice for a noblewoman's children to be taken as surety for their father's loyalty or their family's compliance. If a lord was suspected of disloyalty, or if a truce was being negotiated, children, typically the eldest son, the most valuable heir, might be delivered to the custody of the opposing power as a guarantee of good behaviour. This happened to children from 5 years old upward. It was legal, it was normal, and the mother with no legal standing to prevent it and no formal recourse, if it happened, simply had to find a way to manage the situation. Some did so by cultivating relationships with the people holding their children, writing carefully calibrated letters to their child's custodians, courteous, dignified, never pleading openly, but maintaining a connection that might translate into better treatment for the child. Others use the church as an intermediary, framing the child's welfare as a matter of religious obligation that the custodian had a duty to honour. Others simply waited and wrote, and kept running the estate and kept the letters going and kept the household together. Because the only thing worse than being separated from a child in someone else's custody was being separated from a child in someone else's custody with a collapsing household behind you. The children, for their part, were not entirely passive in this. Medieval sources occasionally give us glimpses of children who navigated their own political captivity with a sophistication that reflects their upbringing. They had watched their mothers manage difficult situations from a very young age. They had seen what steadiness looked like under pressure. They had absorbed by proximity the same set of survival skills that had been formally taught to them and informally modelled for them every day of their young lives. The mother's influence, in other words, did not end when the child left the castle. It travelled with them. It shaped how they read situations, how they responded to pressure, how they held themselves in front of people who had power over them. That is a form of legacy that no chronicle bothered to record, but it shaped the medieval world as surely as any battle did. As we move deeper into this story, there is one more dimension of these women's lives that we've been building towards since the very first moment, one that connects everything we've been talking about into a single, vivid, almost cinematic picture. We've talked about the keys, the accounts, the medicine, the letters, the law, the children. But we have not yet talked about what happened when all of those things were put to their ultimate test, when the walls were the last line, when there was no more time for letters or legal manoeuvres or careful negotiations, when the horizon showed something moving, and that something was an army, and the man who was supposed to be standing at the gate was hundreds of miles away. That moment, the moment a noblewoman looked out from the battlements and saw what was coming, is where every skill, every lesson, every year of preparation either held or it did not. The women who met that moment are waiting for us in the next part of this story, and I think by now you will not be surprised to learn that several of them held. Right then, let us talk about what a siege actually felt like from the inside. Not from the outside is the version history usually tells. The generals, the siege engines, the tactics, the numbers of men. That version has been written and rewritten 1,000 times. Tonight we are going inside the walls. We are standing in the courtyard of a castle that is surrounded, looking up at the battlements, where your own people are watching something approach, and we're asking the question that nobody in those accounts ever seems to ask. Who was giving the orders? Because in a surprising number of cases across a surprising number of centuries and countries, the answer to that question was not a knight. It was not a general. It was the woman of the house who had just looked out from the highest tower, assessed what was coming, with the same clarity she had brought to the grain accounts and the herbal preparations and the legal disputes, and decided that the walls were going to hold. The year is 1338. The location is Dunbar Castle on the southeastern coast of Scotland, where the cliffs drop straight into the North Sea. The castle belongs to the Earl of March, but the Earl of March is not there. He is away. Some accounts say he was with the Scottish forces elsewhere. Others suggest he was deliberately absent to keep his political options open during a particularly complex moment in the Scottish succession crisis. Either way, the castle is being run by his wife. Her name is Agnes Randolph, Countess of March and March. She's also known in the historical record that followed by a name that I think is one of the finest nicknames in medieval history, Black Agnes. The English forces that arrived to besiege Dunbar Castle in January of 1338 were commanded by William Montague, Earl of Salisbury, and they were not a small raiding party. This was a serious military force with serious siege equipment sent to take a strategically important Scottish coastal fortress. The expectation apparently was that the castle would surrender within a matter of days. A woman, a reduced garrison, a relatively small fortification, what was there to hold out. 5 months and a considerable amount of English embarrassment, as it turned out. What makes Black Agnes's defence of Dunbar remarkable is not just that she held the castle, though she did for 5 months against a well-equipped and determined force. It is how she held it, with a combination of genuine military competence and a flair for psychological warfare that contemporary chronicles could not help but record, even when those chronicles belonged to the side she was defeating. When the English deployed their trebuchet, the large counterweight siege engine that could hurl stones of significant weight against castle walls, and began pounding Dunbar's battlements, Black Agnes responded by walking out onto those same battlements directly in sight of the English forces below, with her ladies-in-waiting beside her. They wiped down the section of wall that had just been struck with white cloths delicately, unhurriedly, as if dusting furniture after a minor inconvenience. Let that image sit for a moment. An enemy trebuchet has just struck your castle wall. The message being sent is that your walls cannot hold, that you are helpless, that you should surrender, and your response is to walk out and dust off the damage like a housekeeper dealing with a small mess in full view of the people who caused it. That is not just courage, that is theatre. Deliberate, calculated, extraordinarily effective theatre, because the message it sent back to the besieging force was equally clear. You have not frightened us. You have not even inconvenienced us. Try harder. Contemporary English accounts, and we have several because the English chroniclers found Black Agnes both infuriating and impossible to ignore, describe her as having a remarkable gift for mockery directed at the besieging forces. When the English deployed a large covered siege device called a sow designed to allow soldiers to approach the walls under protection, Agnes reportedly had large stones dropped on it from above. When the device was damaged, she called down from the walls something to the effect that her sow had just farrowed in. Other words that the device had been broken open like a pig giving birth. The English chronicler who recorded this exchange sounds even through the distance of 7 centuries slightly wounded by it. You can hear the professional military humiliation in his description of a woman mocking them from the battlements. William Montague eventually tried a different approach. He captured Agnes's brother John Randolph, Earl of Moray, and had him brought to the castle walls, threatening to execute him unless Agnes surrendered. Agnes called down from the walls that she was not especially concerned, since if her brother died she would inherit his lands. She may or may not have actually said it. Medieval chronicles are not court transcripts, but the spirit of it rings true because 3 weeks later the English gave up the siege and withdrew. They had failed to take Dunbar Castle, and the woman who had refused to give it to them watched them go from the battlements. A Scottish ballad from the period composed in her honour contains a verse that has survived in various translations, and which captures something of how her contemporaries understood what she had done. The verse describes her as sitting in Dunbar, mocking the English earl with taunts that drove him away. She is celebrated not as a warrior, she did not fight personally, but as a commander, someone who held the garrison together through force of will, intelligence, and a complete refusal to be intimidated. Black Agnes is my favourite person in this entire story, if I am being honest. There is something about the image of her walking out onto that battered wall with her ladies and their white cloths that I find genuinely moving, not because it was reckless, but because it was so perfectly calculated. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew that a siege is as much a psychological contest as a physical one, and she played that contest with a skill that the military professionals on the other side of the wall were not prepared for. Now let us move to a different coast entirely. Across the English Channel into the complex political geography of 14th century Brittany, where a different kind of defence was happening, one that would eventually require a noblewoman to take her strategy from land to sea. The year is 1342. The War of Breton Succession, one of those medieval conflicts with the name that makes it sound dry, but contains on close examination some of the most dramatic events of the entire century, is in full swing. Two claimants to the Duchy of Brittany are fighting for control of the region. Charles of Blois, supported by the French crown, against John de Montfort, supported by the English. John de Montfort has been captured by the French and is being held prisoner. His cause seems to most observers to be effectively over. His wife, Jeanne de Montfort, disagrees. Jeanne de Clisson, her name before her marriage, was by all accounts a woman of considerable physical energy as well as political determination. When her husband was captured, she did not retreat into negotiation or wait for a diplomatic resolution. She dressed her young son, also named John, in armour. She rode with him through the towns and castles of Brittany, showing him to the people, rallying support, making the argument in the most visceral possible terms that the Montfort cause was alive because the heir was alive and his mother was fighting for him. This is worth pausing on. A woman riding through a contested duchy in a wartime environment with a small child in armour beside her, making a public case for a political position. That requires a specific kind of physical courage that is different from standing on a battlement dusting walls. It is mobile, exposed, dependent on the responses of crowds she could not fully control. She raised enough support to hold the town of Hennebont when French forces besieged it in 1342. Her defence of Hennebont was by all contemporary accounts personally active. She was seen on the walls, she directed the garrison, and at one point she led a mounted sortie out of the castle, with a small force that struck the French camp from behind, apparently destroying a significant quantity of their supplies, and then retreated safely back to the castle before the main French force could respond. When the situation at Hennebont became critical, the garrison was exhausted, supplies were low, and some of the defenders were counselling surrender. Jeanne went to the highest tower of the castle and looked out to sea. She reportedly told the defenders she could see English ships on the horizon. They thought she was wrong. Possibly they thought she was losing her grip. The English ships arrived that same day. Whether this was intelligence she had received in advance through her communication networks, or genuine observation from a high vantage point, or simply an extraordinary piece of timing, the chronicles do not fully clarify. What they agree on is that Jeanne had held Hennebont until the relief arrived, and that her refusal to accept the suggestion of surrender was the difference between the town falling and the town holding. She went on in the following years to conduct what contemporary accounts describe as naval operations in the English Channel, commanding ships directing raids on the French coast, and generally operating in a sphere of military activity that had no real precedent for women of her class. Her English allies called her in admiration a woman with the courage of a man and the heart of a lion, which is the kind of compliment that was meant genuinely, and lands 7 centuries later slightly differently than intended. She did not have the courage of a man. She had her own courage. It was considerable. It did not need a comparison to be understood. Both of these women, Black Agnes of Dunbar and Jeanne de Montfort, are cases that made it into the historical record because they were dramatic enough, sustained enough, and directed against prominent enough enemies that the chronicles could not avoid them. They are the visible tip of a much larger pattern. The less visible part of the pattern is documented in smaller scale sources, in castle accounts, in local records, in the occasional letter or chronicle passage, that mentions almost in passing that the lady of such and such a place organised the defence when the men-at-arms were away, that she oversaw the closing of the gates, that she directed the distribution of the available crossbows, that she kept the garrison fed and disciplined and pointed in the right direction, through 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 6 weeks of siege conditions. The mechanics of what defending a castle actually required at the practical level are worth understanding, because they speak directly to why the skills we have been cataloguing through this entire story were precisely the skills that castle defence demanded. Provisioning under siege was the first and most critical challenge. A castle that had been properly provisioned could hold for months. One that had not been properly provisioned fell in weeks. The noblewoman who'd been carefully tracking her grain stores, her salt barrels, her ale supply, her preserved meat, the woman who had been doing these accounts every week for years, was in a siege situation, suddenly living on the consequences of those decisions. Every barrel she had ordered, every measurement she'd taken, every miscalculation she had made or avoided, all of it was now the difference between holding and surrendering. Garrison discipline was the second challenge. The men-at-arms who remained in a besieged castle were frequently frightened, frequently exhausted, and frequently susceptible to the kind of quiet demoralization that sets in when an enemy has surrounded you and is making demonstrations of force against your walls. Maintaining their morale, their discipline, their willingness to continue without the authority of a knighted lord, without the formal military rank that would have made command. Automatic required exactly the kind of personal authority and emotional management that these women had been exercising over their households for years. Communication was the third challenge, getting messages out through a siege line to potential relief forces to allied lords to the husband on campaign, who needed to know his castle was under threat, required the same network of messengers, the same coded language, the same strategic thinking about what to communicate and how that had characterized the wartime correspondence we talked about earlier in our story. The skills transferred. The situation was just considerably more urgent. And then there was the psychological dimension, the one that Black Agnes understood better than almost anyone else in our historical record. The side that breaks first in a siege is almost never the side that runs out of weapons. It is the side that runs out of will, the side that decides at some point in the grinding tedium and fear and discomfort of siege conditions that the thing being defended is not worth the cost of defending it. The women who held castles understood this, and they addressed it not with speeches or with formal commands, but with the same daily personal, relentless presence that had characterized everything else they did. They were visible. They were calm. They walked out onto battered walls with white cloths, not because they were reckless, but because they knew that what the garrison needed more than any tactical maneuver was to see someone in authority who was not afraid, or someone who could perform not being afraid with sufficient conviction that it amounted to the same thing. That is a kind of leadership that transcends the specific question of gender entirely. It is just leadership. The particular demanding, irreplaceable kind that comes from knowing your people, knowing your situation, knowing your resources, and choosing in the face of all of it to hold. The stories we have told in this part of our evening together are stories about that kind of holding. About women who looked at an impossible situation, assessed it, with the clear eyes that years of difficult experience had given them, and decided that the walls were going to stand. But what came after the siege? What happened to the inner life of these women, the part that was not visible from the walls, the part that nobody was watching? What did they do with the faith that sustained them, the art that expressed them, and the extraordinary intellectual tradition they participated in, often without any acknowledgement from the world around them? That is where we're going next. Into the solar by the light of a different kind of candle, to find the part of these women's lives that history found most easy to dismiss, and that turns out on close examination to be one of the most fascinating chapters of the whole story. Pull your blanket a little closer, because this part of the story moves more slowly, more quietly. We have spent most of our evening together in motion in the great hall, in the accounts room on the castle walls in the courtroom. We have been tracking women who were always doing something, always managing something, always meeting some demand that could not wait. And all of that is true. All of that was their life. But there was a room in every castle that had a different quality to it. A room where the pace changed, where the light was different, usually south-facing by design to catch the best of whatever daylight was available, where the floor had wooden boards instead of stone flags, which made it marginally warmer and considerably quieter underfoot. It was called the solar, and it was in theory the ladies' private space. I say in theory because privacy in a medieval castle was something of a relative concept. As we touched on briefly in our first part of the story, medieval castle life was profoundly communal. Ladies in waiting slept in or near the solar servants moved through it constantly, and the demands of household management did not respect the concept of time off. But the solar had a different atmosphere than the great hall or the kitchens or the accounts room. It was the space where if a noblewoman could find 20 minutes of relative stillness in a day of relentless obligation, she was most likely to find them there. And what she did in those 20 minutes or those hours on a rare quiet afternoon, or those early morning moments before the household demands began, tells us something about these women that all the accounts and letters and legal records combined cannot quite reach. It tells us what they thought about when nobody was watching. Let me start with the books of hours, because they are one of the most beautiful and most revealing objects to survive from the medieval period, and they are directly connected to the inner lives of noblewomen in a way that is sometimes overlooked. A book of hours was a personal prayer book, a manuscript designed for private devotional use, organized around the canonical hours of the day, the 8 traditional prayer times that structured the daily rhythm of medieval religious life, from matins in the early hours of the morning through compline at the end of the night. Most books of hours also contained a calendar of saints' days psalms, prayers for specific occasions, and in the finest examples, extraordinary illuminated illustrations that could cover entire pages with gold leaf vivid pigments and a level of artistic detail that still takes the breath away when you see them in person. And they were made for women. Not exclusively men owned them too, but the surviving evidence suggests that books of hours were disproportionately commissioned by and for noblewomen. They appear in noble inventories. They appear in wills carefully bequeathed from mother to daughter. They appear in illuminated portraits of noblewomen held in their hands or displayed on reading stands beside them. They were in a very real sense the most personal objects many of these women owned, which makes them windows. Careful, beautiful, slightly fragile windows into the interior world that the historical record otherwise almost never shows us. The prayers themselves followed a prescribed form, but the books were personalized in ways that were entirely individual. The calendar at the front of a book of hours recorded not the universal saints' days, but the specific saints, important to the owner's family dates of births and deaths, that had been entered by hand sometimes over generations, so that a book that had belonged to a noblewoman's grandmother also contained her grandmother's handwriting, her grandmother's grief, her grandmother's particular devotion to a particular saint on a particular day. A book of hours was a family document as much as a devotional one. It was a record of who had mattered and who had been lost and who was being prayed for across the span of a lifetime. Eleanor de Bohun, Duchess of Gloucester, who lived from approximately 1360 to 1499, owned a psalter, a related type of illuminated devotional manuscript that survives and is now held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It is a remarkable object. Eleanor had her own portrait included in the illuminations kneeling in prayer surrounded by her heraldic arms. She annotated it in her own hand in several places, adding notes and prayers that were personal rather than prescribed. What strikes me about Eleanor's Psalter is how deliberate the personalization is. She was not simply using a standardized prayer book. She was constructing something, an object that reflected her specific devotional life, her family, her history. She was in a sense writing herself into a document that was also a conversation with God. For women who had almost no public voice, who could not speak in court, who could not preach, who could not write theological treatises without facing considerable suspicion, the devotional manuscript was one of the few spaces where an inner voice was not just permitted but encouraged. The canonical hours that structured the use of these books also structured the Noblewoman's psychological day in a way that I think is worth understanding, because it provided something that the relentless demands of estate management otherwise did not: predictable pause, matins and lords before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce in the mid-morning, sext at midday, none in the mid-afternoon, vespers at dusk, compline before sleep. 7 times a day the rhythm of the day was interrupted by a moment that was not about the granary or the accounts or the legal dispute or the letter that needed writing. It was about something else entirely, something that in the framework of medieval belief was literally the most important thing: the orientation of the soul toward God. Whether or not you share that belief, the psychological function of those pauses is worth recognizing. In a life that demanded constant outward attention, the hours of prayer required inward attention. They required stillness. They were, in modern terms, something close to a structured mindfulness practice, embedded into the very architecture of the day. I'm not being anachronistic here. Several medieval writers, including Hildegard of Bingen, whom we met in our medical section, wrote explicitly about the importance of interior quiet as a condition for clear thinking. The contemplative and the active were understood as necessarily paired. You could not sustain the active life without the contemplative practice that restored the capacity for it. A noblewoman who prayed 7 times a day was not simply fulfilling religious obligation. She was also, whether she articulated it in these terms or not, protecting her own mental and emotional capacity to function in the face of everything else. Now let us talk about patronage, because this is where the inner life of medieval noblewomen intersected most powerfully with the wider cultural world, and where they exercised a kind of influence that was in some respects more lasting than anything that happened on a battlefield or in a courtroom. Countess Adela of Blois was the daughter of William the Conqueror and the wife of Stephen of Blois, who was one of the leaders of the First Crusade. When Stephen left for the Holy Land in 1096, Adela governed the county of Blois in his absence, with what contemporary sources describe as considerable skill and energy. She corresponded with Pope Urban II. She managed the county's political affairs. She exercised the full range of judicial and administrative authority that the absence of her husband placed in her hands. But what makes Adela particularly interesting for our purposes tonight is what she did with her household when she was not managing its accounts. Adela maintained a literary salon. She was one of the most important literary patrons of her era, a woman who actively commissioned, discussed and encouraged the production of written works at a time when written culture in northwestern Europe was still concentrated largely in monasteries and royal courts. The poet Baudry of Bourget wrote a famous poem about Adela's bedchamber, one of the most elaborate literary descriptions of a noble interior from the entire medieval period. In it he describes a room of extraordinary richness, embroidered hangings depicting world history on the walls, a mosaic map of the known world on the floor, representations of the heavens on the ceiling, and Adela herself in the midst of it all, surrounded by books and scholars and the products of her patronage. Historians debate how literally to read that description. It is after all a poem, and poets have always had a complicated relationship with literal accuracy. but the larger point it makes is well supported by other evidence. Adela was genuinely learned, genuinely engaged with the intellectual culture of her time, and genuinely committed to fostering that culture through her financial and social support. She was not unusual in this. Female patronage was one of the primary mechanisms through which medieval culture was produced and preserved. The great cathedrals, the illuminated manuscripts, the religious foundations, the literary works, a striking proportion of them were funded, commissioned or sustained by noblewomen whose names rarely appear in the popular histories of those same cultural achievements. Marie de France is another figure who deserves considerably more attention than she typically receives in conversations about medieval literary culture. She wrote in the latter half of the 12th century in Anglo-Norman French, and she produced a body of work, the Lays, a collection of narrative poems and a collection of fables that is sophisticated, psychologically nuanced, and genuinely pleasurable to read even in translation today. We do not know much about her life with certainty. Her name, Marie de France. Marie from France is the label attached to the manuscripts, not a fully documented biography. She was almost certainly associated with the Anglo-Norman court, possibly with the court of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose cultural influence radiated through the aristocratic world of northwestern Europe in the second half of the 12th century. What we know for certain is that she was read. Her manuscripts circulated. Other writers referenced her work. She was part of the literary conversation of her time, not a footnote to it. And her writing is interesting precisely because of where it pushes against the expectations of its era. Her lays deal consistently with questions of loyalty, desire, constraint, and the experience of people, often women, who are trapped by obligation into lives that do not reflect their inner realities. They are not protest literature in any modern sense. They are too subtle for that, too careful, too embedded in the conventions of courtly narrative. But they are literature that takes women's inner experience seriously as subject matter, in a world that almost everywhere else treated women's inner experience as either irrelevant or dangerous. Reading Marie de France, you feel the pressure of everything we've been talking about tonight finding its way into art. Not directly, not as complaint or argument, but as story, as the particular kind of truth that can only be told sideways. The embroidery that filled the hours of noblewomen's private time deserves a slightly different kind of attention than we gave it earlier in the story when we talked about textiles as economic value. Because embroidery was also memory practice, it was also storytelling, it was also in some cases political statement. The narrative embroideries that survive from the medieval period, the Bayeux tapestry being the most famous, but there are others tell stories that their makers chose to tell. The choice of subject matter, the emphasis the figures depicted and the figures omitted, these were not random decisions, they were editorial decisions. They were choices about which version of history was worth preserving in thread. A noblewoman who embroidered scenes from her family's history or from scripture, or from the narratives of saints she particularly venerated, was not just doing something decorative to pass the time. She was making something that would last longer than she would. Something that might hang on the wall of the castle her grandchildren inhabited. Something that would tell them in the language of image and colour, and the particular quality of handwork who she was and what she valued. That is not embroidery as pastime, that is embroidery as archive. As the transmission of memory in a medium that was available to her precisely because it was considered too domestic to be taken seriously as historical record, which means it survived. Because nobody thought to suppress what nobody thought was important. I find something almost beautiful in that irony. The things that were considered too small to record turned out to be exactly what lasted. Let me come to something that I have been thinking about throughout this part of our story, and that I think is worth naming directly. The inner life we have been describing, the prayer, the books, the patronage, the embroidery, the quiet 20 minutes in the solar was not separate from the rest of what these women did. It was continuous with it. The same intelligence that managed the accounts also chose the subjects for the embroidery. The same network of relationships that handled the legal disputes also shaped the literary patronage. The same steadiness that held a garrison together also held a family together in prayer after terrible news arrived. These women were not divided between a public functional self and a private interior self. They were the same person in both places. The interior life was not an escape from the demands of the outer world. It was the source from which the capacity to meet those demands was renewed. There is something in that integration that feels genuinely instructive, not in a self-help way, not in any prescriptive sense, just as an observation about how human beings sustain themselves under prolonged difficulty. The women who lasted, who managed, who held things together across years and decades of wartime uncertainty, were almost universally the ones who had found some form of renewal in the quieter parts of their days. Prayer for those who believed, beauty for those who were moved by it, intellectual engagement for those who were fed by ideas. The small repeated disciplines that maintained the inner architecture even when the outer one was under constant stress. And all of it was about to face its greatest test. Because for some of these women, the outer world changed in a way that the inner one had been preparing them for, without their knowing it for their entire lives. The husband did not come home. And the question of what happened next, what widowhood meant, what it cost, what it unexpectedly gave, is one of the most surprising chapters in this entire story. It is also in some ways the most human one. That is where we're headed, and I think it is going to stay with you. The news did not always arrive by letter. Sometimes it came the way all the worst news travels sideways unexpectedly, through a source you were not prepared for, a merchant passing through who had been near the battle. A soldier from the same campaign who arrived at the gate before any official messenger did. A rumour that moved faster than horses through the network of villages and market towns, arriving at the castle door before anyone had thought to send a formal notification. And sometimes, of course, it came in a letter, sealed with an unfamiliar seal, or worse, with a familiar seal belonging to a chaplain or a senior knight, who had taken on the task of writing what her husband no longer could. We do not have many first-hand accounts of the moment a medieval noblewoman received news that her husband had been killed in battle. The chronicles were not interested in that moment. They were interested in the battle, in who won and who lost and how many men fell. The woman reading the letter in the castle solar does not appear in those accounts, but she was there. And the moment she finished reading was the moment everything changed again for the second time in her life, after the first time when the keys were placed in her hands and the gate closed behind him. Because here is the thing that medieval society understood about widowhood, even if it rarely said it plainly. A widow was in a very specific legal and social sense more free than a wife. Not free in any absolute sense. Not free from grief. Not free from pressure, not free from the 1,000 obligations that continued regardless of her personal circumstances, but free in the technical legal sense that a married woman was not. A widow under medieval English law had legal standing. She could appear in court in her own name, she could own property, she could sign contracts, she could make a will. She could, in theory, choose whether to remarry and whom to marry, though in practice that theory was heavily modified by the interests of the crown and her overlord. For a woman who had spent years, sometimes decades, running an estate with full practical authority and zero legal authority, the moment of widowhood was the moment the law finally caught up to the reality she'd been living. That is a strange kind of grief, the acquisition of rights you had been exercising without permission, arriving at the same moment as the loss of the person those rights were supposed to depend on. I have been thinking about how to describe that particular emotional complexity, and I keep coming back to the same image. It is like being handed the deed to a house you've been building with your own hands for 20 years on the day the person you built it for died. The house is yours. It has always, in every practical sense, been yours. But the moment you hold the deed, the reason you built it is gone. Let us talk about what actually happened in the weeks and months after a medieval noblewoman became a widow, because the social and legal choreography of it is revealing. The first pressure arrived almost immediately, not from grief, from suitors. A wealthy widow was one of the most valuable commodities in the medieval marriage market. She came with land, with established household networks, with proven administrative competence, and if she was young enough, with the capacity to produce more children. The men who wanted access to all of those things did not typically observe a lengthy period of respectful distance. The crown had an official interest in controlling the remarriage of wealthy widows because the feudal obligations attached to their estates needed to be managed by someone who could fulfill the military service requirements. An unmilitary widow holding vast tracts of land was a problem for the feudal system, which was built on the assumption that land and military service were inseparable. The solution enshrined in Magna Carta in 1215, in clauses that specifically addressed widows, was that a widow should not be compelled to remarry against her will. She had the right to remain unmarried if she chose, but she might have to pay the crown for that right a fine, sometimes substantial, for the privilege of not being forced into a marriage she did not want, which tells you something uncomfortable about what the right to remain unmarried actually cost in practical terms. Some women paid it readily, because what they got in exchange was worth considerably more than the fine. The vowist tradition is one of the more fascinating and underappreciated aspects of medieval widowhood, and it gave women a specifically religious mechanism for resisting remarriage pressure. A vowess was a woman, typically a widow, who had formally taken a vow of chastity before a bishop in a ceremony that had a quasi-religious status. The vow was not a full religious vow of the kind taken by nuns. A vowess did not enter. A convent did not surrender. Her property did not withdraw from the world. She continued to live in her own household, manage her own estates, move in secular society. But she had placed herself formally and publicly under the protection of a religious commitment that made it socially and canonically complicated to pressure her into remarrying. The Church's jurisdiction over marriage and chastity vows gave vowesses a degree of protection from the remarriage market that secular law alone could not guarantee. And the historical record shows a striking number of noblewomen choosing this path not because they were necessarily particularly pious, but because the vowess status was a practical tool for maintaining the autonomy that widowhood had given them. It was in its own way another form of the legal forum shopping we talked about earlier in our story, using the Church's framework strategically to achieve a practical outcome that the secular framework would not easily provide. Margaret Beaufort is perhaps the most extraordinary example of a medieval English noblewoman navigating widowhood and marriage and politics and everything else, with a combination of intelligence, religious devotion, and sheer strategic tenacity that I find genuinely astonishing. Margaret was born in 1443. By the time she was 12 years old, she'd already been married twice, or once, depending on how you count a very early arrangement that may not have been fully consummated. By the time she was 13, she was pregnant with her only child, a son who would eventually become King Henry VII of England. Let me pause on that for a moment. 13 years old, pregnant, giving birth to a child who had found a royal dynasty. Margaret survived the birth narrowly by some accounts, and the physical toll appears to have been significant enough that she had no more children afterward. She outlived 3 husbands, She navigated the chaos of the Wars of the Roses with a political acuity that kept her alive and her son's claim to the throne alive through decades of shifting allegiances and genuine physical danger. Her son Henry spent most of his childhood in exile. Margaret spent those same years in England maintaining his claim, cultivating the network of relationships that would eventually make his return possible, and doing all of this while occupying a series of careful political positions that allowed her to survive regardless of which Yorkist or Lancastrian faction was temporarily in power. She was at various points in her life formally allied with people she was secretly working against. She signed loyalty oaths that she was simultaneously undermining through private correspondence. She managed the appearance of compliance with a Tudor political instinct that her son clearly inherited from her. In 1483, after the death of King Edward IV, and the political crisis that followed, Margaret was involved in a conspiracy to place her son on the throne. When the conspiracy failed, she was attainted, her property was seized, her legal rights were curtailed. Her punishment was to be placed in the custody of her then-husband Thomas Stanley. Thomas Stanley did not apparently make her custody particularly restrictive, whether that reflects his personal respect for her, his own political calculations, or simply the practical reality that Margaret Beaufort, under nominal house arrest, was still more politically connected and strategically active than most people at full liberty. The historical record suggests that her effective confinement was considerably less confining than it was supposed to be. 2 years later, her son landed in Wales with a small force, marched across England gathering supporters, and defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Margaret Beaufort watched her son crowned King of England. She's reported to have wept throughout the ceremony, whether from joy, from relief, from the weight of everything it had cost to reach that moment, or from some combination of all three that defies simple categorization. Nobody who was there thought to record. She went on to found 2 Cambridge colleges. She established a preachership at Cambridge. She was a significant patron of William Caxton's printing press, and her patronage helped shape what early printed books in English looked like and which texts they preserved. She took the vowous vow in 1499, placing herself formally outside the remarriage market at the age of 56, which, given that she had been navigating that market since she was 9 years old, she had perhaps more than earned. She died in 1509, outliving her son by 7 weeks. I do not think I can add anything to that biography that would make it more remarkable than it already is. I will just let it sit there for a moment. What Margaret Beaufort's life illustrates in extreme and unusually well-documented form is something that was true in less dramatic versions for hundreds of medieval noblewomen. Widowhood was genuinely paradoxically one of the conditions under which women could accumulate and exercise the most real power. Not because grief was an opportunity, it was not, and I want to be careful not to romanticize what was in many cases a genuine personal loss alongside the legal and social transition, but because the combination of legal standing, accumulated practical experience, established networks, and the freedom from the immediate control of a living husband created conditions in which capable women could act with an effectiveness that the married state had formerly prevented. Alice Chaucer, the granddaughter of the poet Geoffrey Chaucer, and eventually Duchess of Suffolk, is a slightly less dramatic but in some ways even more instructive example of this. Alice was born around 1404. She married 3 times, each marriage more politically significant than the last. Her third husband was William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, who was one of the most powerful men in England during the minority of King Henry VI, and eventually one of the most hated, scapegoated for England's military failures in France, and murdered by sailors who threw him overboard in 1450. Alice survived. She managed the family's enormous wealth and estates through the chaos that followed her husband's death, through the accusations of treason that threatened to destroy everything through the Wars of the Roses that engulfed England in the following decades. She outlived her husband by 30 years. She died in 1475, having preserved the family's position and fortune through one of the most turbulent periods in English history. Her household accounts from the later period of her widowhood show a woman of extraordinary practical competence, detailed meticulous, clearly in personal control of financial decisions that a lesser administrator would have delegated entirely. She commissioned buildings. She managed extensive patronage networks. She maintained the family's political position through careful relationship management with successive kings and factions. She was by any measure one of the most powerful private individuals in mid-15th century England, and her power was directly a product of what her widowhood had made legally possible. Here is the question that I think ties this all together, the one I keep returning to when I think about the widowhood chapter of this story. What did these women feel about their husbands? It sounds like an almost naive question against the backdrop of the political analysis and the legal manoeuvring and the estate management we've been doing all evening. But it is not naive. It is in some ways the most important question. Because the medieval nobility did not marry for love, as we have noted. Marriages were political instruments, and yet the letters survive. The books of hours with their personal notation survive. The devotional prayers for the safe return of specific named people survive. The evidence that these women were not emotionally indifferent to the men they married, whatever the circumstances of the marriage, is woven through the documentary record in ways that are impossible to ignore if you are paying attention. Margaret Paston writes to her husband with an efficiency and practicality that is almost entirely focused on business, and then occasionally a line slips through. A request that he take care of himself, a note that she is praying for his safe return, something small, almost lost in the practical demands of the letter that carries a weight. The practical language around it cannot quite contain. Blanche of Castile, after her husband's death, apparently wore black for the rest of her life. Whether that was political theatre, genuine grief, or both medieval mourning practices rarely drew clear lines between those things, she maintained it for 30 years. The emotional texture of these women's relationships with their absent and sometimes permanently absent husbands is something we will never fully recover. The letters give us glimpses. The devotional objects give us more. The wills, which sometimes contain remarkably personal bequests and requests, give us others. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that these were not women who were indifferent to the people they lost. They grieved, they prayed, they remembered, and they got up the next morning and ran the estate. Both things were true at once. Always. That is perhaps the most human thing about all of them. There is one more part of this story to tell, the final chapter, the one that asks the question that has been quietly building under everything we have discussed tonight. We have talked about what these women did and how they did it and who they were. We have met some of them by name. We have seen them in the accounts room, in the solar on the castle walls, in the courtroom, in the nursery. But here is what I want to end with. Here is the question that I think matters most. Why do we not know their names? Not the exceptional ones, the Agnes Randolphs and the Margaret Beauforts and the Blanche of Castiles, but the ordinary ones, the thousands of women who did everything we have talked about competently and without dramatic incident across the 5 centuries of the medieval period. Why did history lose them, and what does it mean that we're only now beginning to find them again? That is the final part of our story. And I think after everything we have been through tonight, it is the one that is going to stay with you the longest. There is a particular kind of silence in the historical record that took me a long time to learn how to read. It is not the silence of things that never happened. It is the silence of things that happened constantly, reliably, essentially. and that nobody thought worth writing down because the people doing them were not the people the writing was for. We have spent this entire evening together filling in that silence, piece by piece, name by name, account roll by medical chest, by castle wall, by solar window. And now, in this second to last part of our story, I want to step back from the individual women and look at the larger question. The one that once you start asking it, you cannot stop. How did it happen? How does a civilization manage to lose the people who are holding it together? The answer, as it turns out, is not accidental, and understanding it changes how you read history, not just medieval history, all of it. Let us start with who was doing the writing. In medieval Europe, the production of written records was concentrated in two places, the church and the royal administration. The church maintained the chronicles, the narrative histories that recorded events, battles, the deeds of kings and bishops and great lords. Monastic scriptoria copied manuscripts, preserved learning, and occasionally produced original historical writing. The royal administration maintained the chancery records, the legal and financial documents of governance, the writs and charters and court rolls that documented the formal transactions of power. Both of these institutions had the same fundamental characteristic: they were run by men for men about men. The monastic chroniclers who wrote the histories we still largely rely on for our understanding of the medieval period were almost universally male clergy. They had specific interests, specific frameworks, specific ideas about what was historically significant. Battles were significant. The deaths of kings were significant. The outcomes of political disputes were significant. The transfer of land between powerful lords was significant. The daily management of a castle by the lord's wife in his absence was not significant. It was expected. It was background. It was the thing that happened while the significant things were happening elsewhere, and therefore it did not require documentation. This was not malice exactly. It was not a conscious conspiracy to erase women from the record. It was something more mundane and in some ways more difficult to counter. It was a set of assumptions so deeply embedded in the culture of record-keeping that the people doing the recording did not experience them as assumptions at all. They experienced them as obvious truths about what mattered and what did not. And those assumptions compounded over time. Each generation of historians worked from the records the previous generation had preserved. The records had been filtered through the assumptions of the people who made them. The histories written from those records reproduced the same absences, and the absence became gradually the appearance of a reality that women had not done much, had not mattered much, had been, as the image we started with suggested, sitting in corners, embroidering, waiting. The historian Eileen Power understood this earlier and more clearly than almost anyone else in her field. Power was born in 1889 in England, and spent her career at the London School of Economics, where she became one of the most respected medieval economic historians of her generation. Her 1922 book, called Medieval People, was one of the first serious scholarly works to take ordinary medieval people, including women, as worthy subjects of historical study in their own right, not merely as background to the doings of kings and battles. Power was not sentimental about it. She was rigorous, funny, enormously widely read, and absolutely clear-eyed about what the sources could and could not tell you. She understood that recovering women's history from the medieval record required learning to read different kinds of sources that had been overlooked, precisely because they seemed too mundane to be historically significant. The manorial court rolls, for example. These are the records of the local courts that operated on every significant medieval estate, the records of petty disputes, small transactions, fines, for minor violations, decisions about land use and tenant obligations. They are extraordinarily boring to read. They are also, for anyone interested in how ordinary medieval life actually functioned, extraordinarily valuable. and they are full of women. Not women doing dramatic things. Women doing ordinary things, appearing as witnesses, initiating small legal complaints, buying and selling goods, being fined for violations of local regulations, leaving bequests to neighbours and relatives. Women being, in other words, the active, present, engaged members of their communities that the grand narrative historical sources systematically fail to show. The coroners' rolls, the records kept by medieval coroners of sudden and unexplained deaths, are another source that historians like Power use to extraordinary effect. They are grimly fascinating documents full of accidents and misadventures that give you a vivid sense of how medieval people actually moved through their physical world. And they too contain women everywhere. Women working, women travelling, women involved in the full range of activities that the chronicle tradition suggested they had nothing to do with. Archaeology has added another layer to this recovery project in recent decades. The material culture of the medieval period. The objects, the buildings, the physical traces of daily life does not distinguish between men and women in the way that written records do. A decorated bone comb from a castle excavation does not note in its margin that it belonged to a woman, and therefore its existence is not historically significant. It simply exists, and its existence is evidence of a life that the documents might not have recorded. The distribution of objects in castle excavations has helped archaeologists map which rooms were used for which purposes and by whom. The tools found in certain spaces, the food residues analysed from particular contexts, the architectural features of the solar and its relationship to the spaces around it. All of this builds a picture of how women actually moved through and used the physical spaces of medieval life, independent of what the written record chose to say about them. The wills are perhaps the most personal of the surviving sources and among the most revealing. Medieval wills, particularly those of noblewomen who had the literacy and the legal standing as widows to make them, are documents of extraordinary intimacy. They record what people valued, what they wanted to pass on, who they remembered and who they wanted to be remembered by. The wills of medieval noblewomen bequeath books of hours to daughters and granddaughters with specific personal annotations. They leave herbal remedies to the castle's household healer. They bequeath specific embroideries to specific religious houses with instructions about where they should be displayed. They contain requests for prayers for named individuals, children who died, young husbands lost in wars that the chronicle would record only as military events, friends and ladies in waiting, whose names appear nowhere else in any historical record. In these bequests, in those requests, in those carefully considered distributions of the objects of a life, you hear voices that the chronicles silenced. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the particular clarity of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she had done and who she wanted to remember her. I want to say something here that is personal and that I think is worth saying plainly. The process of recovering these women from the historical record is not just an academic exercise. It is not just about correcting the record, though it does that. It is about something more fundamental. Every society has people whose labour is essential and whose contribution is systematically unrecorded. Every era has its version of the medieval noblewoman, the person doing the indispensable work that the official narrative treats as background, the person whose competence is assumed and therefore invisible, whose failures would be noticed and whose successes simply continue the baseline that everyone else depends on. We're not so different from the medieval chroniclers as we sometimes like to think. We have our own assumptions about what is historically significant and what is not. We have our own blind spots about whose work matters and whose is just expected. The medieval noblewomen we've been talking about tonight could not see their own erasure happening. They were too busy managing it all, but we can see theirs with 8 centuries of distance. And that distance is a gift, not because it makes us superior, but because it gives us the angle to understand a pattern that is much easier to see in the past than in the present. What would it mean to learn from that? To look at our own moment and ask honestly, whose labour are we not recording? Whose competence are we assuming rather than acknowledging? Whose name will not appear in our chronicles? And what would we need to change about how we write them? These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. They are the questions that good history asks when it is doing its job. Here is something that moves me every time I think about it. The women we have met tonight, the ones who left the most vivid traces in the historical record, almost none of them set out to be remembered. Nicola de la Haye was not defending Lincoln Castle for posterity. She was defending it because it was hers and someone was trying to take it. Black Agnes was not mocking the English forces from the battlements for the entertainment of future historians. She was holding her castle because that was what the situation required. Margaret Paston was not writing her letters as a contribution to the archive of medieval women's experience. She was writing them because her husband was away and the estate needed managing and the threats were real. They were just doing what needed to be done. And that particular quality of unself-conscious competence of people performing at the full extent of their capabilities, not for recognition but simply because the work required it, is, I think, the most important thing this story has to teach us. The name on the wall matters less than whether the wall was held. The record in the chronicle matters less than whether the people in the castle were fed. The title that the law assigned matters less than whether the judgment in the Great Hall was fair. These women knew that. They had to know it because the alternative was to spend their lives devastated by the gap between what they were doing and what they were credited for. And they did not have time to be devastated. They had things to manage. There is one more thing I want to touch on before we come to the end of this story. It is something that has been sitting in the background of everything we have discussed tonight, and it is time to bring it into the light. We have talked about the women who succeeded, the ones who held castles, won legal battles, raised kings, founded abbeys, wrote literature, managed estates across decades of wartime uncertainty. We have talked about them because their stories are in the record, because their competence was dramatic enough or sustained enough to leave traces that 8 centuries could not entirely erase. But there were also women who did not succeed. Women whose castles fell, whose estates were lost, whose legal battles failed, whose children died despite the herbal preparations and the careful nursing. Women who broke under the weight of it quietly and visibly in rooms that no chronicle described. Women whose names appear in the record only as the wives of men who did something noteworthy listed and then forgotten. Their erasure is in some ways the more complete one, because the exceptional women left traces by virtue of their exceptionalism. The ordinary women who struggled and failed left almost nothing, except the absence itself. The silence in the record that once you learn to read it tells you something true, that the work was real, that it was hard, that it cost something, that the people doing it were human, not superhuman, and that the price of the invisible labour that held the medieval world together was paid in full every day by people whose names we may never recover. That is worth knowing, especially if we cannot name them. And that brings us to the end of everything we have been building toward tonight. One final part of the story, the part where we pull everything together and sit with the question that has been underneath all of it, from the very first moment when the keys were placed in her hands. If these women did everything, managed everything, fought for everything, held everything together, what exactly were the men fighting for? Or to put it another way, what is history really, if the people who held the world together are not in it? The answer is not comfortable, but it is, I think, the one this whole story has been moving toward, and it is the one we will end with. We started this story with a ring of keys Do you remember a cold morning somewhere in England in the 12th century? A man strapping on his armour, a woman standing in the doorway, the keys placed in her hands without a word, without a ceremony, without a title or a contract or any official acknowledgement of what was being transferred. Just keys, and everything those keys unlocked. We have spent this entire evening walking through what those keys meant. We have been in the accounts room tracking grain supplies and ale barrels and silver pennies across multiple currencies. We have been in the solar reading letters written by candlelight to men who might already be dead by the time the words arrived. We have stood on the battlements watching an army approach and made the decision without flinching that the walls were going to hold. We have sat with the locked medical chest and the bone mortar and the careful knowledge of what comfrey does to a fracture and what garlic does to an infected wound. We have navigated the church courts and the royal courts and the particular legal creativity required to act with no formal legal standing in a world that depended entirely on your ability to act. And now we are here, at the end. At the moment when, if this were a medieval castle, and the Lord had just ridden back through the gate, the keys would be handed back. I want to sit with that image one more time because I think it contains something important that we have not quite finished unpacking. The returning of the keys was not a defeat. It was not a diminishment or a surrender or an acknowledgement that the woman had been filling in temporarily for the real authority and was now relieved to step aside. It was, if the historical record tells us anything, something considerably more complicated than that. Because the woman handing those keys back knew something that the man receiving them did not fully know. She knew the estate in a way that months or years on campaign could not have given him. She knew which tenant was behind on rent and why, and whether the reason was genuine hardship or calculation. She knew which section of the South Field has been producing poorly for 3 seasons and needed a change in crop rotation. She knew which of the knights who remained behind had handled himself well under pressure and which had needed managing. She knew the precise state of the stores, the condition of the walls, the outstanding legal disputes, and where they stood the relationships with the neighbouring lords, and what those relationships were currently worth. She knew everything, and he was walking back in from somewhere else knowing the things that campaigns teach tactics to reign, the specific grammar of military violence, and not knowing the things that running an estate teaches. The transfer of the keys, in other words, was never a simple transfer of authority. It was a handoff of institutional knowledge so complete and so irreplaceable that the man receiving those keys was for a period afterward dependent on the woman he had just nominally relieved. History recorded the moment as a restoration of the natural order. The Lord returns, the lady steps back, everything goes back to normal. What actually happened in practical terms was something more like a detailed briefing from the person who'd been running the operation to the person who was now theoretically in charge of it. Conducted, of course, without any of the language that would have made that power dynamic explicit, because the social conventions of the time required the fiction of the returning lord resuming his rightful authority. Both people in that room knew the fiction for what it was. The keys just changed hands, and then probably the next morning she was back at work, managing the things that needed managing, handling the things that needed handling. The Lord was home, which changed the social dynamics and the legal standing and the way things were officially described, but it did not change the fact that the estate was a complex, demanding, essentially continuous management problem that required sustained daily attention from someone who actually understood it. That someone was still her. I have been thinking throughout the time I've spent with this material about a question that seems simple, but opens up into something quite deep. What is civilization exactly? The standard answer involves the things that appear in history books: empires and their expansion, wars and their outcomes, dynasties and their succession, art and architecture and the accumulated achievements of the human mind at its most ambitious. These things are real. They matter. The history that records them is not wrong to do so. But underneath all of it, underneath every empire and every dynasty and every monument and every military campaign, there is something that has to keep running in order for any of the visible things to be possible. Food has to be produced and stored and distributed. The sick have to be cared for. Children have to be raised and educated and shaped into the people who will carry the civilization forward. Disputes have to be resolved. Resources have to be managed. The fabric of daily life has to be maintained with a consistency and a competence that does not get to take days off because the political situation is interesting. That work is the foundation. Without it, the impressive edifice above it collapses. The generals need to eat. The kings need someone to manage their estates while they're making history. The knights need medicine when they come back wounded. The heirs need raising. The letters need writing. The walls need holding. The women we have met tonight did all of that. Not occasionally, not as an emergency measure, not as a temporary substitute for the men who would normally be doing it. They did it as the permanent structural foundational work of a civilization that then went on to credit its monuments and its battles and its kings without noting, even in passing, who was making all of that possible. This is not a small oversight. It is a systematic misreading of how human civilization actually functions, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here is what I find genuinely moving about the women in this story when I think about all of them together as a group, rather than as individuals. None of them was trying to make a point. None of them was consciously demonstrating that women were capable of running things. They were not activists. They were not feminists in any modern sense. They were not making an argument. They were just doing what needed to be done with the capabilities they had in the circumstances they were given. And the circumstances they were given were often extremely difficult, and they met them with a combination of practical intelligence, emotional resilience, and quiet courage that I find honestly more impressive than almost anything I know about the men who surrounded them. Not because the women were better, not because the men were worse, but because the women did it all without the infrastructure of support, recognition, authority, or acknowledgement that made the men's achievements legible as achievements. They did it in the margins. They did it in the background. They did it in the gap between what the law said they could do and what the world required them to do. And they did it so well, so consistently across so many centuries and so many countries and so many individual lives that the civilization they were supporting was able to sustain its wars and its crusades and its political upheavals and its dynastic ambitions without ever quite noticing that it had left the lights on. The lights were always on because someone was always there to tend them. We know some of their names now. Nicola de la Haye, who held Lincoln Castle twice against all odds, and was described by her enemies as ingenious and vigorous and evil-intentioned, and who probably took all three as compliments. Agnes Randolph Black. Agnes, who dusted off the trebuchet damage from her castle walls with white cloths, and watched the English army walk away defeated. Blanche of Castile, who rode through a contested duchy with her 12-year-old son in armour, and built him into a king who became a saint. Margaret Paston, who asked for crossbows and poleaxes, and also almost as an afterthought a pound of almonds because the walls needed defending, and life still required almonds, and both of those things were equally real. Margaret Beaufort, who kept a royal claim alive through 3 decades of danger, and lived to watch her son crowned and wept through the whole ceremony. Ella of Salisbury, who served as Sheriff of Wiltshire, and then founded an abbey, and then became its abbess as if running a county had simply been the preparation phase. Isabella de Fours, who refused every remarriage offer for 32 years, and died one of the most powerful landowners in England. Hildegard of Bingen, whose medical knowledge was centuries ahead of the university physicians who dismissed her, and whose music is still being performed today, 850 years after she wrote it. Adela of Blois, who governed a county and maintained a literary salon, and whose bedchamber a poet described as a map of the entire known world, because that is the kind of room her mind required. And behind all of them, unnamed, unrecorded, indispensable, the hundreds and thousands of women whose keys were also handed over on cold mornings, who also managed the estates, and wrote the letters, and tended the sick, and raised the children, and held the walls, and whose names the chronicles decided were not worth the ink. We know they were there. The silence in the record tells us so. That silence is not empty. It is full of people, full of lives, full of the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of how to hold a complicated world together under difficult circumstances practiced by human beings who are never given credit for knowing it. Knowing that changes something. At least it changed something for me the more time I have spent with this material. It changed how I read historical accounts. It changed which questions I ask when I encounter a narrative that seems to be missing half the story. It changed what I consider impressive and what I consider historically significant. If a castle stood for 500 years, I want to know who managed it. If a dynasty lasted for 3 generations, I want to know who raised the children. If a medieval town survived the plague at a higher rate than its neighbours, I want to know who organised the response. Not instead of the military history, not instead of the political history, alongside it, because that is the whole picture. That is what history actually is when it is doing its full job. There is one last thing I want to say, and then I am going to let you sleep. The women in this story did not need us to remember them. They were not waiting for recognition. They were not keeping a record in hopes that someone 8 centuries later would find it and understand. They were too busy for that. They had things to manage, but we need to remember them. Not for their sake, for ours. Because the habit of noticing invisible labour, of asking whose name is missing from the account, of understanding that the foundation is as important as the monument built on top of it, that habit makes us better at reading the world we're actually living in. The women who ran the castles while the men were at war were not background characters in someone else's story. They were the story. The story just forgot to say so. Now it has. And on that thought, on the image of those keys and the woman who knew exactly what to do with them, and the world that depended on her knowing, and the history that almost lost her name, I want to thank you for spending this evening with me. Genuinely. From somewhere close to the heart of why I do this. These stories matter. The people in them matter. And you sitting wherever you are at whatever hour it is there with your blanket and your settling thoughts, you are part of why they get told. Every time you listen, you push back a little against the silence that would have swallowed them. So thank you. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself more awake than you expected, or more moved than you anticipated, or simply quietly glad that you know these names, now please consider leaving a comment below. Tell me which woman surprised you most. Tell me which part of the story you will still be thinking about when you wake up. Tell me where in the world you're listening from, because I genuinely love knowing that this reaches places I have never been. And if you are new here, welcome. There are many more evenings like this one waiting for you on this channel. Many more stories that history almost lost. Many more people whose names deserve to be spoken out loud again. The next story is already waiting. It begins in a different time and a different place with a different kind of erasure and a different kind of survival. And I think if tonight felt right to you, that one will too. For now, though, let the story settle. Let the names fade slowly into the quiet. Let the image of those keys, iron heavy, warm from her hands, be the last thing you carry into sleep. The walls held. They always held. Good night.